listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
This is London, but coming to you, of course, all over the world. My name is James Giles, journalist and broadcaster, and your supply teacher this evening here at the Global Open University of the Airwaves, standing in for double GG, George Galloway. Don't panic, George is still with us. He joins us with a short message now. Good evening, George.
I am so terribly sorry not to be with you this evening for the mother of all talk shows, because it's going to be such a great show, such an important Sunday night just before the American presidential elections, and such powerful and interesting guests in Abby Martin, Professor Wolf, and of course our own Moats medic, Dr. Rango, Dr. Ranjit Brar. I myself am having minor surgery. Unexpectedly, although I knew I'd have to have it at some stage, but unexpectedly I needed it today, and therefore it's going to be impossible for me to be with you. But the good news is I'll be with you on Wednesday night for Midweek Moats, George Galloway, bare knuckle. Meanwhile, please give your attention to young Dr. James. He is in charge of the Open University this evening. Enjoy the show.
Thank you, George. I'm sure me and the entire team behind the glass here wish you well in recovering from your surgery. And we look forward to seeing you here on Wednesday evening for Moats Extra. Now, you can watch the mother of all talk shows on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter, on George's pages and on RT's various platforms. If you're in the Washington, D.C. area of the United States, you can listen in crystal clarity on 105.5 FM or on AM from Burning City to Burning City, right across the United States, from coast to coast. This is radio with pictures, the Global Open University of the Airwaves, where you are positively encouraged to talk back to the teacher, albeit this week it's your supply teacher. We're listened to by over 1 million people every week, and that's a benchmark that we have to keep. So if you're watching this on social media, please click the share button and share this with your friends, with your contacts. Now, what a week it has been. In Britain, Lockdown 2 begins this Thursday, supposedly, so the Prime Minister would claim, for a month. And I'll be joined by our very own Moats medic, Dr. Ranjit Brar, as we examine the impact that Boris Johnson's second lockdown will have here in Britain. In Westminster this week, Sir Keir Starmer's leadership has been thrown into chaos as he suspended former leader Jeremy Corbyn for Jeremy's response to the EHRC report into anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. Corbyn, of course, has crowdfunded a fighting fund of over £300,000 to challenge such a suspension in the courts, which is bound to prove a headache for Labour if Starmer holds firm in Corbyn's suspension. Over the pond, the US election is less than 48 hours away. Trump is closing in on Biden. The gold standard Iowa poll in the Des Moines Register today put Trump 7 points ahead of Biden and described Biden as fading away in Iowa. But as record numbers have voted early and voted by post, will Trump's last-minute red wave be enough to get him over the line? Well, we're joined tonight by Dr. Richard Wolf, Abby Martin, Dr. Ranjit Brar and other guests to discuss all of this and more. But of course, here at the mother of all talk shows, you are actively encouraged to talk back to, in this case, me, the teacher. Do call in. The numbers will be appearing on your screen shortly to ring in. But first of all this evening, we're joined by award-winning journalist, broadcaster and commentator, Patrick Christys, who should be joining me now on the line. Good evening, Patrick. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm not too bad, thank you, sir. Doing well as a stand-in for George. Patrick, obviously, it's been a really turbulent week not just in Britain, but across the world. It's been a real busy news week. Shall we talk first about the lockdown? It's a bit too little too late, isn't it?
Well, it certainly seems that way, doesn't it? I mean, what I thought initially before we get stuck into the nitty-gritty of all this, which is that it's all very well and good saying that, OK, one thing would have been to follow the direct scientific advice, which would have been, as any scientific advice would be, if you're giving your top scientists the remit of how do we save the most amount of lives, that is, in any case, regardless of COVID, to basically put everybody in a lockdown for as long as physically possible. And what Professor Chris Whitty said yesterday, which I thought was interesting and valiant actually, was, look, there is also a few other things at play here, which is also the political elements, the economic elements. However, you're absolutely right. The advice scientifically was for Britain to go back into a full national lockdown at least 3 weeks ago. Now, Boris Johnson rallied against that. I think he will say that he rallied against that because that's fundamentally not the type of human being he is. This is a massive curtailment on people's civil liberties, isn't it? And that's certainly not a very conservative thing to do. It's also very damaging economically, and that's the issue that he's had to deal with. But just in terms of, obviously, as I'm sure we'll come on to, the lockdown itself, I mean, it was chaotic and disorganised, to say the least, wasn't it?
Well, I think it certainly was. I mean, obviously, as you said yourself, the scientific evidence from SAGE in September was to go into lockdown. It's been delayed for more than a month. Obviously, people have died. And at least from what I think we seem to be seeing, it seems to be having some sort of an effect in the polls. Labour seem to be rising. The Tories seem to be falling. Do you think this will just be a short-term blip for the Johnson administration? Or, is this the beginning of a Starmer rise as sort of a prime minister in waiting kind of figure, which obviously so far he's kind of been unable to break away from the past?
Yeah, it's such an interesting situation, isn't it, really, because it's so fast moving. I mean, actually, I must say, I think it's probably the latter, just based on the fact that actually COVID won't be sorted anytime soon. And until it is sorted, I don't see how any incumbent prime minister would be taking a hit in the polls. Firstly, Boris Johnson delayed this announcement last night 4 times, which looks chaotic and disorganised, and that was terrible. He then was very clear that his lockdown would last only until the 2nd of December. Well, it was 15 short hours, wasn't it, before Michael Gove appeared on Sky News and said, actually, this might be indefinite, which is again, chaotic and disorganised. But thirdly, and I think most importantly in a sense, the presentation of this announcement last night was absolutely disastrous. These slideshows of doom that we've been seeing relentlessly were absolutely atrocious. There was too much information on any one screen there for anyone to understand. Now, fair play. It's my job as a political journalist to try to be on top of that. I've got to hold my hands up and say I had to pause that briefing a couple of times so that I could see the slides and try to digest it. Now, no disrespect to anybody else whatsoever, of course, but how on earth would the, completely normal man and woman on the street who's watching that be able or be expected to reasonably digest all of that information in one fell swoop and understand it and then be told that's the justification for the reason why we're massively curtailing your civil liberties? I'm sorry, but that's not the way to do politics. It's not the way to do anything, frankly. But there is one big incident here, one big problem that's gone underreported for me, and I think this is going to rear its head, which is that they seem to be saying the way that we would get out of this lockdown is if the R rate drops below 1. Well, because COVID takes a couple of weeks at least to essentially affect you drastically, I suppose, and realistically, maybe 3 weeks, I suppose, before you see any kind of difference in the hospital admissions. Well, they're going to make their decision, aren't they, in about 3.5 weeks' time about whether or not they reduce the lockdown measures. Well, in 3.5 weeks' time, the R rate will not have dropped below 1. So we're going to have an extended lockdown. And they might as well have just been honest about that. And I think it's a really damaging issue, this, really, both politically, as I'm sure we'll come on to, because the Tory party now is in disarray, right? It's damaging politically, but it's damaging in terms of the public trust. And I think there's a huge issue at play here for Boris Johnson now. And it is quite a worrying situation, really, to be governed at the moment, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you talk about chaos, not only in the Tory party, but also the country. And that, of course, is further compounded by the previous sort of Tory concession to the ever-growing rebellion in the House of Commons with anti-lockdown MPs on the backbenches of the Conservatives. And obviously, this announcement was leaked in the press on Saturday. There was no communication with backbenchers. They are, frankly, fairly and rightly rather angry with Boris Johnson, with Number 10, with the government. Now, obviously, these measures will have to be voted through, debated in Commons and passed. Labour have said, of course, that they'll support it, and so one imagines, therefore, that it will pass. That's despite the Tory revolt underway, which has its ringleaders, including, of course, Sir Graham Brady, Sir Ian Duncan-Smith. I mean, what's your take on the scale of the Tory rebellion? I mean, is this, a rise, Rishi Sunak as the next Tory leader? Is this the starting pistol which spells the end of Boris Johnson's premiership? I mean, what's your take?
Look, I think the one thing that can't be underestimated here is the only reason we're actually even getting a vote on this is because Matt Hancock had to promise Tory backbenchers the last time we rolled out a load of quite drastic lockdown measures that the next time, I promise you, you will get a vote on this, because before it was ruled by diktat, right, which is frankly not democratic, okay? And so this is the only reason why we're getting a vote. And now the reason why this vote will get through, okay, maybe 40, well, what I'm hearing anyway is about 40 Tory MPs will vote against it. So regardless, this will get through, not just because of the support of Labour, but because of the Conservative majority anyway, so fine. But that's a big number, right? And as you've rightly said there are some big hitters there. Sir Graham Brady, chairman of the Backbench 1922 Committee, Sir Ian Duncan-Smith, a former Tory leader, for goodness sake, are dead against this. And what there is, and there are two main issues at play, right? The economic front, and the main one, because every single human being, especially if you become an elected MP, your main issue is self-interest, depressingly so, it is. It is. And that becomes your ability to get re-elected, right? Because otherwise you have to join the dole queue. And now you've got a massive issue economically first, which is that the government has already borrowed more than 208 billion quid over the last 6 months. We've massively extended our debt pile to stand at 2.1 trillion pounds. Furlough alone between April and September cost 40 billion quid. And unemployment before the latest lockdown measures was projected to hit 7.5%, which now you would imagine necessarily would have to rise, okay? So the economic argument and the Rishi Sunak argument you've rightly raised there is a pertinent one. And I think Rishi Sunak is now well placed, also because he's quite dishy, isn't he? And that does work on the doorstep. But secondly, and the main important thing is the electability element of it. The last opinion poll put Labour 3 points ahead of the Tories. I expect that to rise in the coming days. The red wall is this big issue now, because the Tories obviously won that back, or won it for the first time, depending on which way you want to look about it. And now, actually, all of these MPs that are sitting there in that northern, traditionally Labour heartland are thinking, well, I'm going to be out of a job whenever you have an next general election. And that means that actually from now, not just over COVID, which is going to hang around like a bad smell for a very long time, but over anything else, really, they are going to have their own self-interests at heart, and they're going to be much more susceptible to voting against Boris Johnson going forward. And that is a huge issue for this Prime Minister, and is a huge issue for the democracy of this country as well, frankly. So, yes, it's dangerous times for Boris. It could well be the death knell, depending on how long this lasts, of course.
Well, it certainly could. And, of course, Boris Johnson previously has criticised Sir Keir Starmer in pretty strong terms, I think, by anyone's standards. Captain Hindsight is a favourite phrase of his. But, of course, the biggest captain of the fair ship hindsight appears to be Boris Johnson himself. After saying for weeks on end, there will be no national lockdown, the tier system will work fine. He now, of course, after all these weeks, has given in and said, yes, we will have to have a national lockdown. I mean, a vaccine inevitably at some point, it's looking like, will come to fruition in Britain. But is there any vaccine that you think can save Boris Johnson's political career?
Well, the main vaccine that could happen is the fact is that at a next general election, at any general election, the opposition leader at some point has to actually put forward a manifesto. And Keir Starmer, so far, we're not in danger of finding out what he thinks about anything, are we? I don't know, actually, what his policy on education or I could probably have a good stab at it, but I don't know, because he's not told us what his policies are on anything. Now, you would imagine that he would be able to put that together in time. So that would be the way that Boris Johnson could get out of this. If the next election arises and Starmer does a Corbyn and starts promising everybody free broadband and frankly a load of nonsense, then I suppose, yes, Boris Johnson could win the next general election. What Keir Starmer has done, and you raised that point there, is that, for a while I was thinking, does he understand the concept of opposition? You know, he was just turning up. He was like the kind of worker that we all have, that co-worker we all have who turns up and does very little and collects their paycheck at the end of the month. And I was wondering what he was really doing. But he's played quite a shrewd game in the last 10 days, actually, which is he backed Boris Johnson into a corner over lockdown because he knew that Boris was inevitably going to shove us into another lockdown. And he preempted that, didn't he, by calling for it earlier than Boris did. So it now looks like Boris is following Keir's advice, right? He also backed Corbyn into a corner over the anti-Semitism thing. Not to dwell on this, but the fact is he knew that Jeremy Corbyn couldn't wholeheartedly accept the results of that report, and therefore, if he set the boundaries of unless you accept this report wholeheartedly, you've got no place in the Labour Party, what he's done there is create a situation where he can shove Jeremy Corbyn and his cronies to one side and therefore essentially claim complete control of the Labour Party, which is what any leader of any party wants. So Keir Starmer has kind of really got his backside into gear. You know, it's that kind of adage of you wait all day for a bus and then two buses come at once. And that's kind of what Keir Starmer has done. So if he maintains that, then I do think actually Boris is in serious trouble here. But yeah, no, just to answer your question directly, I mean, Boris, this could be... The fact is, it's not just the fact that you're curtailing people's civil liberties, it's the other stuff that's gone around it. You know, the free school meals issue has been massive. When people go into the polls at the next election, whenever that is, there are a few things that people really remember, aren't there? There are landmark things. And even if Boris Johnson delivers a no-deal Brexit, which is something that a lot of these northern heartlands conceivably wanted, they remember the fact that Boris put them into lockdown chaotically. They remember the fact that he didn't want to feed hungry kids over the winter. And actually, you don't get voted back in if you do that kind of stuff.
No, absolutely. I think you're right, Patrick. I mean, before we leave you for the evening, let's just talk just a little bit more about the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn. Obviously, as you say, he's been suspended by the party over comments about the EHRC anti-Semitism report. Obviously, Corbyn's described it all as dramatically overstated. Do you think we're going to see a mass resignation of Labour members? Perhaps a breakaway new socialist party?
Look, no, to answer your question directly, no, I don't think we will. And the reason why I don't think we will is that because those parties don't tend to do that well historically. When you break away from a major party, you tend to actually enter the political wilderness, as has been found out by the likes of Chuka Umunna, Anna Soubry and co. Was it change.org or whatever the living heck their name ended up being, you know. And we've seen that historically as well with other groups. And again, it comes back to my point about people being essentially largely self-interested, especially politicians. And when Sir Keir Starmer is ahead in the polls, which he is now, and I would expect naturally that situation to continue for a very period of time, it's unlikely for me that a lot of people would leave what would be conceived to be a potentially winning team, right? And so I don't think we're going to see a huge amount of mass resignation. We might see some resignations from significant Labour positions, but I don't think we're going to see them leaving the party. And also the way that this has been framed, right, which is that I think that there seems, my perception of this on the doorstep, as it were, about this anti-Semitism report thing is it's not necessarily about what the realities of the situation are, unfortunately. It's about how it's perceived, right? And I think most normal, right-thinking people, whether it's right or wrong, do perceive the idea that Jeremy Corbyn is at his core a fundamentally nice bloke, but he just doesn't quite get this issue, and that's a concern. And if you side with him over that, I'm not convinced that that is a particularly good look in the public's eye. Whatever your own personal views might be about this, right? I don't think that's the best look at the moment, the way that it's being portrayed. And so, no, I don't expect mass resignations. If they do enforce mass resignations, then frankly, I don't think Keir Starmer will mind too much, because he's got the freedom now in 84 or 85 seats now in that red wall to pick his own candidates the next general election, by the way. He doesn't have to rely on anybody else, so he can do that. I don't see it happening. I don't see why it would make political sense for people. And as long as he remains ahead in the polls, I just don't think it will happen.
Patrick Christis, thank you very much indeed for joining the mother of all talk shows. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Now, we've launched our Twitter poll for the evening here on the mother of all talk shows, and it's on Labour's greatest shame. Anti-Semitism, of course, this week was described by Jonathan Ashworth, Labour's Shadow Health Secretary, as the greatest shame to ever afflict the party. Depending on who you ask, of course, they will give you a different answer. And so, Labour's greatest shame, is it anti-Semitism, is it the Iraq War, or is it NHS privatisation through the likes of PFI under the Blair years? The numbers should be appearing on your screen, and of course you can vote via @GeorgeGalloway on Twitter. I'm going to take a break very shortly. After this, we'll have Abby Martin, as well as some of your social media comments. So keep them coming on George's Twitter and Facebook.
All these happy children makes me sick.
Trick or treat!
Oh, how scary. Aren't you all precious? What a pretty bunch of children.
I'm a witch. I'm a mummy.
Yes, and I suppose your mummy is off in a crack den somewhere. And what are you supposed to be?
Systematic decline of social values and community and the inevitable heat death of the universe. Duh.
Right. Well, less of that. Piece of candy between you. Don't go eating it all at once, you ungrateful little maggots. And I better not see you in more of groups of 6. What do you want?
No children to go hungry in the UK.
And who are you supposed to be?
Dr. Marcus Rashford, MBE.
George Galloway and the mother of all talk shows. Join us at the College of Knowledge, where there are no tuition fees.
Welcome back to the mother of all talk shows on Sputnik Radio across the States, of course, and also on the internet all over the world through the wonders of modern technology. Jamie, what's been happening on social media? Do tell me.
Lots going on tonight. Obviously, lots of well wishes from George. Lots of people in the comments concerned. He is watching. We do know that. So, hello, George. Lots of love in the comments for you tonight. We do wish you well in your recovery. But, you know, lots of people really just trying to make sense of this new lockdown. Got a comment here from a teacher who says that they are in class in front of around 30 students, not much room for social distancing, and not much cause for mask wearing in schools currently, so a bit confused really. Charlie here says the government spent 10 minutes showing us graphs outlining that cases increased rapidly as soon as schools went back, yet proceed to tell us that schools are the safest place to be. I'm thoroughly confused. So lots of confusion about that new national lockdown, which is going to come in to force on Thursday. But if you do have questions, why don't you keep them coming to us tonight, and we'll try and make sense of it for you. James is going to be speaking to lots of very smart people tonight, so hopefully we can answer some questions. Do keep them coming in. The email to onair@moats.tv, tweet to @GeorgeGalloway, and I'm going to be keeping an eye on all your social media comments throughout the course of today's programme, so get them in, keep them coming, and let's give James a bit of a big up too. People asking James, where is your hat? Welcoming you to the programme, but wondering why haven't you got anything on the top of your head?
Alas, I don't have the hat. I believe Georgia's still got that at home. But listen, Jamie, thank you very much indeed for that. We'll pass back to you later on. Obviously, in addition to emailing in, you can also call and speak to me in the studio in place of George. The number is 0207 7982 255 if you're in Britain, or of course in America 001 757 744 4480. We're joined now by Abby Martin on the show, on the mother of all talk shows. Abby, good evening to you. You're a presenter and journalist. You present the Empire File. Obviously, it's a busy time for you. The US election less than 48 hours away.
Oh my God, yes. And well wishes and much love to George Galloway. We hope that you're well. It's a nightmare, you know. There's no good outcome here. Of course, a lot could happen. Trump constantly sowing division and making people feel like they can't trust the mail-in ballot system. And then you have the GOP blatant voter suppression, multiple layers of voter suppression, suing multiple states to basically prevent early ballot access. And then look at Joe Biden. I mean, he's someone that has basically centered his campaign upon a repudiation of Bernie Sanders. And he is doing nothing but appealing to moderate conservative voters. And because of this strategy, which is a failed strategy, we saw this fail in 2016, he is losing young black voters to Trump and losing Latino voters to Trump. You see very troubling polls in key battleground states. So while national polls look like Biden has it in the bag, if you look at these key swing states, it is much closer than we think. And actually he's doing worse than Hillary was with some key demographics in 2016. So very concerning trends.
Are there any particular states that Biden will have to win, in your opinion, to win the election?
Well, there's several different ways that this could play out. Look, in the U.S., we have, the greatest democracy in the world, where we're actually invading other countries to spread our great democracy. We do not have one person, one vote. So we have something called the Electoral College, which means that voting is largely symbolic in most states here. And really, the election will only come down to around 12 swing states. So there's a variety of ways that this could play out where Biden could win several of those states. So I don't actually know the breakdown, but all I know is that several things could happen that could turn this election very ugly, where we might not know the outcome for weeks to come, where this actually could turn to the Supreme Court, which Trump has just stacked, or to the House, where we could see the one vote, one state, where Trump also has an advantage. So, this is a mess. It's a huge mess. And because we have such a messed up democracy, quote unquote, we're in for a wild ride ahead.
Absolutely. I mean, you've mentioned the Electoral College there just very briefly. Perhaps for those viewers internationally who perhaps aren't aware of just how the American system works, where obviously you can win the most votes, as Hillary Clinton did in 2016, yet still lose the election. Do you just briefly explain to our listeners just how that works and obviously whether you believe it is actually truly democratic?
This is a very antiquated system that was basically in place so people could appeal to representatives, originating from white slave owners, the slaveocracy, to essentially trust their ability to represent us, right? Go to DC and say, okay, we have the representation of this demographic, and so we can put our vote forward. The problem with this is that it puts way too much into small states with very little populations compared to giant populous cities like, let's say, California and New York. So if you had one vote per person, obviously the Republicans would be sidelined every time. So the Republicans would have a really, really tough time actually winning elections. So over the course of the last couple decades, with voter suppression, with gerrymandering, and with basically maintaining this antiquated, absurd system in the U.S., that we actually need like a constitutional amendment to change. And we would need the majority of the states to actually sign on board to change. And so the majority of the states would have to agree to that. And we know that they won't, because this is going to put them at an enormous disadvantage in every election moving forward, where let's say you have someone in Iowa, their vote is basically worth more than someone living in New York or Los Angeles because of how warped this bizarre system is, where you have 2016, Hillary Clinton won by millions of votes. Joe Biden could actually win by millions more votes than Hillary Clinton actually won in 2016 and still lose by the Electoral College. This is something that completely needs to be rescinded, revamped, and abolished to actually have a free and fair democracy here in the U.S. And I just don't see that happening.
Obviously, this election, owing to the coronavirus, there's been very heavy amounts of absentee ballots, of write-in voting by post. Do you think that's an indicator of who's going to win? I mean, Trump has spoken about this last-minute sort of red wave, obviously encouraging his supporters to turn out on the day. Do you think the fact that there's so many postal ballots is to Biden's advantage, or perhaps even to Trump's?
Yeah, so I think this is really hard to tell because of the pandemic, right? So it's really, really impossible to really see if this early wave that we've seen, and which is, by the way, over half of who all voted in 2016. We've seen tens of millions of people come and turn out their vote, more than half of all the people who voted in 2016. So it is an enormous amount of people who have put in early voting. However, I don't know until Election Day. I think that it's going to be really hard to tell if this is an indicator of one way or the other. We do know that the mail-in ballots, because perhaps Biden and his supporters believe in the pandemic, as opposed to Trump and his supporters who are constantly downplaying the pandemic, encouraging people to show up and vote. We see massive rallies being held, door-to-door outreach during a global pandemic that Trump's campaign is carrying out. So the early mail-in ballots have actually seen 50% Democratic, as opposed to 30% or so for Trump. So there is a difference there, but we don't know until Election Day. And unfortunately, this actually puts the Republicans at a bigger advantage as well, because mail-in ballots are more likely to be discarded. In Pennsylvania alone, you could see up to 100,000 mail-in ballots be thrown away for something as stupid as a mistake on the envelope.
Obviously, this election, like you say, Biden is forecast by almost everybody's prediction to win the popular vote by more so than Hillary Clinton did in 2016, by a real significant margin. Will Trump accept the result of this election, bearing in mind that he has repeatedly throughout the campaign accused postal ballots of being somehow fraudulent or not valid?
Right. So Trump has hinged all of his rhetoric on basically sowing distrust in the electoral system in terms of mail-in ballots, and also outright tried to sabotage the post office. He appointed some giant Trump donor who has actually investments in the competitors of the post office. You've seen him break down these mail drop-in boxes all across the U.S. I mean, you really cannot make up how dystopian this whole election cycle has become. And every day on the campaign trail, it seems like Trump is basically saying he will not accept states counting votes past Election Day. You actually have seen him pontificate whether or not this is legal. This is completely legal. This is standard practice, especially when you have the GOP outright suing states to suppress the ability of accepting these votes before Election Day. So multiple swing states are actually not able to count votes until Election Day. And then you have Trump actually saying that should not be legal and the court should not be allowed to do that. So there's a lot going on here, coupled with the notion that Trump is actually egging on right-wing militias to go, quote unquote, patrol the polling places. You have his son, Don Trump Jr., saying every able-bodied person coming to be part of Trump's army. So this could actually discourage a lot of people to come and show up on Election Day as well. But yes, that is the big question, right? Is Trump going to respect the results? I think, of course, if it's a landslide, he has no choice. I think if it's contested, there's a lot of different troubling scenarios that could play out. You could see it go to the Supreme Court, like we had the right-wing coup Bush v. Gore, where the Supreme Court essentially handpicked our dear President George W. Bush in 2000. And you have Trump has stacked the Supreme Court with 3 right-wing justices, Amy Coney Barrett being the latest, who all the Democrats have done to try to stop that vote was basically politely ask her to recuse herself if she did end up being the deciding factor to pick our next president. And then you have what I mentioned before, which is this scenario that could go to the House, where you could have every state basically deciding, and that puts the Republicans at an advantage as well. So, you know, the voter suppression with all of these other things, and Trump just being such a crazy narcissist, where he's already been hinting for so long that he will not step down, you could see a really ugly flashpoint for political violence, especially if there's, you know, the outcome where we're waiting for weeks, where Trump maybe wins the Electoral College outright, but the mail-in ballots haven't been counted yet. So you could see weeks actually where perhaps Biden will win later on. Those weeks are going to be very, very dire here in the U.S. We could see a lot of violence in the streets and a lot of clashes, and that is going to be something that is going to be pretty scary.
Obviously, last election in 2016, Trump played very successfully to the so-called states in the Rust Belt. Has he delivered for those states? I mean, can he count on them for supporting him again this time round?
You know, Trump has really kind of lost some flair that he had back in 2016. I think that was in large part because of Steve Bannon being his right-hand man, feeding him a lot of talking points. So you saw him really hammering in on these populist talking points and rhetoric back then, where he was talking about trade. You haven't really seen him hammer Biden on NAFTA, on any sort of trade deals this time around. Back then, you saw him basically posing himself to the left of Hillary Clinton, I guess, which wasn't a hard thing to do coming from the outside of the political establishment, on a lot of these populist talking points. Somehow he's managed to still convince people over the last 4 years that he's anti-war. I still can't wrap my mind around that. That's what we've been doing with Empire Files, is trying to debunk that con artistry in terms of Trump ramping up militarism around the world. But he's still playing to that isolationist base, that populist base, who I think largely doesn't want the U.S. to be in these endless regime change wars around the world. They want to redirect resources here at home, build up infrastructure, et cetera. So in some ways, yes, he has been touching upon the needs, I would say, of the populists who are still looking at him as this outsider who's quote unquote fighting the deep state. But at the same time, he has lost that fire, and you see that play out in the last couple debates. He just doesn't have it anymore, and he seems to be getting desperate. So even though I do think Trump does have a very good chance of winning still, I think that Trump is perhaps paying too much attention to these polls, and he is losing it publicly, becoming increasingly desperate, and just losing a lot of that flair.
Indeed. I mean, whoever wins on Tuesday, whenever the result is announced, as you say, I imagine too, it will be weeks after the event, once all of the mail-in ballots have been counted. Will Biden, Trump, make any shift in US policy, be it domestic or international? I mean, George, here on the mother of all talk shows in previous weeks, have described Trump and Biden as two cheeks of the same backside. Would you agree with that summary of them?
As a far leftist, absolutely. I mean, look, they both run their campaigns on anti-communism. Of course, Trump, I think, is a little bit scarier in terms of the possibilities of political repression, climate change denial, and the outright denial of the pandemic. So when you break it down there, I think, yeah, Biden, of course, will perhaps have some sort of national coordination for the pandemic, at least not outright denying climate change, possibly have some sort of skeletal thing of the Green New Deal where we can move forward with at least acknowledging that this is a threat, and perhaps not, emboldening fascist police forces like the Trump campaign is doing. However, that being said, I think largely when you look at Biden's entire campaign and the way that he's been running it, not only has he been appealing to anti-communists and right-wingers, but he has also said repeatedly that this is about the character of the United States. This is about a return to normalcy, promising his Wall Street donors that nothing will fundamentally change for them, bragging that he won over the Bernie Sanders wing. So when it comes to the fundamental differences, the millions of people who have lost their jobs, who have lost their health care, who are suffering in this country, living paycheck to paycheck, absolutely nothing will change for those people at all. And then, of course, when you look at the rest of the world in terms of the U.S. hegemon, the CEO of the empire, whoever it may be, I fear there is very little difference. The difference has become very, very blended there. All around the world, you see both of them kind of egging each other on to be stronger. You see Joe Biden putting out ads calling Trump a China puppet. I mean, imagine that, where Trump is basically fear-mongering us and trying to get us into a Cold War with China as we speak, constant military drills around the South China Sea. And then you go into Latin America, where Biden has basically just said he still supports the incubator baby puppet, Juan Guaido, and is saying that this is weeks ago. Can you imagine saying you support Juan Guaido as recent as 2 weeks ago? And this is what Biden did. So I fear that you'll see them trying to carry out just a more savvy version of Trump's blundering regime change posturing in Latin America. But in terms of the grotesque sanctions that have been genocidally implemented around the world, from Iran to Venezuela, you have not seen Biden address that whatsoever. You have not seen any of the Democratic Party denounce that and say that they will roll those back. So aside from the nuclear deal, which I hope that we will reinstate with Joe Biden, I would say that there is very little difference between the two candidates when it comes to the U.S. empire.
Look, we're going to go to the break, but before we do, Abby, you're the expert. I'm the enthusiastic amateur. In your expert opinion, who is going to win the presidential election?
Frighteningly so, I think Donald Trump will win the election, because I remember all too well from 2016, everyone, all the pollsters, all the pundits, the sneering punditry telling us how stupid we were, forever thinking that Hillary Clinton wasn't the next anointed one. And I just fear that there's a lot of people who are not being counted in these polls. I fear that Biden was the worst possible candidate at the Democratic primary to face down Donald Trump. And I just have a really bad feeling. I think that we should expect the worst. And no matter what happens, we need to be prepared to fight in the streets and to galvanize and mobilize grassroots organizing, because no matter who wins, we need to build up an anti-war movement. We need to build up a people's movement to challenge whatever's next.
Abby, thank you very much indeed for joining the mother of all talk shows. It's been a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm going to take a short break. We'll be back in 2 minutes or so. Just a reminder, of course, that George Galloway is not in tonight. He's having surgery in the morning, so he's having the night off. And so I am your supply teacher here at the Open University of the Airwaves. My name is James Giles, journalist and broadcaster. Stay tuned, don't go anywhere. We'll be back in a moment.
Well, how did I do?
I'm sorry, Prime Minister. At no point did you drive on the left-hand side of the road, and instead of driving us forward, you made several U-turns. We haven't gone anywhere.
Well, I think you'll find if you turn backwards enough times, eventually you'll go forward. So, did I pass?
No, you failed miserably.
But my teacher said I'd get much higher grades.
Better luck next time.
This doesn't happen to people like me. You leave me no choice.
I'm sorry, but rules are rules, even for Prime Ministers. What on earth is that?
My mutant pet.
Dominic Cummings?
No. Big algorithm. Get it?
Global higher education with one of the world's best-known iconoclasts. The mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
This is the mother of all talk shows with me, James Giles, standing in this evening for double GG, George Galloway. Now, before we had Abby on the show, we put up our first Moats poll of the evening. What is Labour's greatest shame? So far, the results have been pretty conclusive. Anti-Semitism, 11% down 2. Iraq war, a staggering 75%, that's up 1. And NHS privatisation at 14%, that's also up 1. That poll is still running. You can find it at George Galloway on Twitter. Do vote in that poll and tell us what you think Labour's greatest shame is. Before later on in the show, we talk to a very special senior guest, a former advisor to Jeremy Corbyn. Jamie, how's the social media looking? What have people got to say? Have they been enjoying what they've been seeing so far?
Absolutely, James. Abby is definitely a crowd pleaser. The Moats audience have got a lot of love for Abby. Bit of love for you too, James. Dennis Hink says the bloke is doing a great job so far. I'd have to echo that. Fantastic job so far, James. But yes, lots and lots of comments, thousands upon thousands coming in thick and fast. Honestly, it's quite a struggle to look over each and every one, but I am doing my best, I do assure you. Got an email here from Stuart in West London who says, I would not be surprised if Joe Biden gets elected as president. He is found wandering the gardens of the White House, mumbling to himself, where am I, where am I? You know, lots of concern over the potential mental health of the Democratic presidential candidate. I've got a comment here from Joanne who says the voting system in America is the most undemocratic system in the world. Syndicat here says the ruling class in the US want to stoke a civil war, working class versus elite class, because they are terrified of revolution. And a big comment in capital letters here, Trump is a traitor. So lots of comments on the back of your chat with Abby Martin there about the US election. Got one from Laura here saying Trump is the only man for the job. Let's all be serious. This isn't a game. Biden isn't up to the job. Let's stop playing around and really think what you're doing. Marwin says Trump will win Iowa, Ohio and Florida. This will not be enough for him to win the White House. Joe here saying the polls are not accurate. I would say only 35% of Trump voters have voted. Most MAGAs are waiting until November 3rd to cast their votes. And it's going to be an eventful day, well, evening for me and you, James. The November 3rd. Not only will I be celebrating my birthday, I'll be staying up to watch those elections come in. Will you be staying up too?
I will be indeed, Jamie. Yes. No, thank you very much indeed for that. It'll be certainly an interesting week ahead, not only with the US elections, but plenty of other news pieces to be catching up on as well. Thank you for that, Jamie. We'll see you again at 8 o'clock with the news. Coming up on the show this evening, still to come, Professor Richard Wolff will give his take on the ever exciting US presidential election, less than 48 hours to go now. Moats medic Dr. Ranjit Brar will be joining us, giving his take on the second national lockdown here in Britain, announced by Boris Johnson. Amongst others as well, we'll have a former staffer of Jeremy Corbyn's also giving his take on the current crisis engulfing Keir Starmer's new leadership, new look Labour Party. George, of course, isn't here this evening. You're stuck with me as your supply teacher instead. George will be returning, however, for Moats Extra on Wednesday evening. That takes place every Wednesday at 8 p.m. London time, exclusively on George's Facebook page and on Patreon. It's Moats Bare Knuckle. We do have a promotional clip. Simon, are you possible to play that now?
There are people known to me who've suffered from a virus that Kate thinks doesn't exist. We better hear why she thinks that.
I know a paramedic who told me that they're told to put their sirens on and drive around with the sirens on so it looks like they're busy. They are being
told... Who would tell them? That's quite a serious allegation. Who told ambulances to drive around with their sirens on so that it looks like they are busy? Can you give us a name?
Well, I'm open to nurses and doctors and patients. I know how they've been threatened. I know what's been happening.
Threatened?
We have a barrister to...
Did you say threatened?
Please allow me to finish, George.
Did you say threatened? I want to be clear. You said threatened. I'm sorry.
It makes people break, and this is what's happening. And this is why they're going up.
I'm sorry. Can't take any more of Kate Shemirani. A little knowledge is indeed dangerous, and as is the pretense of expertise. And then when questioned, well, look, I'm not an economist. Well, I'm not this and I'm not that. I'm just a simple nurse.
Wednesday nights just got a whole lot wilder.
How marvellous. And you can watch Moats Extra on a Wednesday, as I say, on George's Facebook Live, on Patreon, patreon.com/George Galloway. And it costs just $1 per show. There's no excuse not to. So we look forward to seeing George again then. The lines are, of course, open. Please do ring in. If you're in Britain, the number is 0207 7982 255, or in the US, 001 757 744 4480. Ian in Hounslow is on the line. Go ahead, Ian. Hello, Ian. We'll come back to Ian. There appears to be some kind of technical difficulty there. We'll be shortly. Chris is joining us now. Chris, good evening to you.
Right.
Good evening, Chris. Chris in Hong Kong, how are you?
Come on.
It appears we have a problem. It appears we have a problem with our phone lines. The joys and wonders of modern technology. Ian and Chris, we will be back in touch with you, as we will with everybody who's called in this evening. It'd be great to hear from you. We heard earlier on this evening from journalist and broadcaster Patrick Christys, who is an award-winning broadcaster here in Britain, regularly found on Sky News, Talk Radio, and he is now involved in a new social media series called How So Then, which you can find on Twitter at How So Then. The first video in the series is all about Charles Dickens. It's narrated by Patrick. Let's take a look.
I'm in Hyde Park in central London. This is a royal park, so you could say that it's owned by the Queen, although I think it's unlikely we'll see her walking the corgis here anytime soon. It has been the site of many important events, such as concerts by the Rolling Stones, Pavarotti, the huge anti-Iraq war demonstrations,
Give peace a chance.
And of course, Speaker's Corner, where disputatious and cantankerous individuals get on a soapbox and give their contrarian views about the world.
You tell me who's the friend of Britain, Obama or Trump?
Shame on you!
No,
Shame on you! Shame on you! Shame on you!
I'm standing on the site of the Great Exhibition of 1851. Although it was supposed to show off the world's achievements, realistically, it wanted to make one thing really, really clear, that Britain stood alone as a leader in industry, textiles, steel and innovative inventions. A massive towering glass structure was built to accommodate all of these exhibits. It was the length of 3 football pitches and it was nicknamed the Crystal Palace. Queen Victoria visited the site 3 times and her husband Albert was listed as one of the organisers, although I think that's probably quite doubtful. The great and the good of British society passed through here, the likes of Lewis Carroll, of course Charlotte Bronte as well, Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, and of course the star literary turn was Charles Dickens, the internationally renowned author. It's impossible to exaggerate how successful he was. Think J.K. Rowling and then some. Even a century later, his books still sell more than 1 million copies a year. By the time that he arrived at the exhibition, he already had the smash hits of Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby and the Pickwick Papers behind him. But still to come was A Tale of Two Cities, with perhaps the most famous opening line in literary history. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was certainly the best of times for Dickens, but it was the worst of times for the people he wrote about. The poor, the millions who toiled away in the industries that helped to create the fabulous exhibits that were on display in the Crystal Palace, which of course boasted of Britain's greatness. He may have cared about the poor in Britain, but the truth is that Dickens absolutely despised the Chinese, and by today's standards there can be no question, he was a racist.
Consider the greatness of the English results and the extraordinary littleness of the Chinese. Go from the silk weaving and cotton spinning of us outer barbarians to the laboriously carved ivory balls of the flowery empire, ball within ball and circle within circle, which have made no advance and been of no earthly use for thousands of years.
This was less than a decade after the First Opium War, where the British naval fleet and soldiers defeated China to keep the drug trade open. China banned opium and destroyed valuable bales of it, so Britain went to war to protect the trade. But they did more than that. They also claimed Hong Kong in the peace treaty. A second war followed on the same grounds, narcotics, and this was just 5 years after the Great Exhibition. Dickens compared the might and muscle of British industry with what he referred to as the Little Exhibition, the Chinese one. He waxed lyrical about the power of the British printing press, which produced the Times every single day, and compared it with the antiquated Chinese version.
Well may the 3 Chinese divinities of the past, present and future be represented with the same heavy face. Well may the dull, immovable, respectable triad sit so amicably, side by side in a glory of yellow jaundice, with a strong family likeness among them.
Another symbol of Chinese backwardness for Dickens was the 160-foot teakwood ship known as the Keying, otherwise known as the Chinese junk. It was acquired or perhaps stolen by several British people in Hong Kong and sailed back to Britain, where it was moored on the Thames and kept as a popular tourist attraction. Dickens was utterly contemptuous, referring to it as a ridiculous abortion, a pen tray and a floating toy shop.
The best that seamanship can do for a ship is to paint two immense eyes on her bows, in order that she may see her way, and not to hang out bits of red rag in stormy weather to mollify the wrath of the ocean. Thousands of years have passed away since the first Chinese junk was constructed on this model, and the last Chinese junk that was ever launched was none the better for the waste and desert of time.
Western hatred of China has a long history, although now that China is a manufacturing powerhouse and will soon be the world's largest economy, those with Charles Dickens' outdated views have to be a little bit more refined. To paraphrase Charles Dickens' most famous character, Oliver Twist, please sir, can we have no more?
How marvellous. I think How So Then are going to be doing some very brilliant things going forward. Do check them out on Twitter, at How So Then. That was Patrick Christys on Charles Dickens. Now, of course, you're stuck with me tonight as your supply teacher here on the Open University of the Airwaves, standing in for George Galloway. He, of course, will return this Wednesday for Moats Extra. Until then, of course, we wish him a speedy recovery after his minor surgery. And here to give us an update is Mrs. Galloway, Gayatri. Gayatri, what's crackling?
Well, don't worry, guys. He's fine. He's literally really fine. It's just bad timing. Unlucky. As you said, no, we're already anticipating this minor surgery, so it's just bad timing. If it was a few days before, he would have been here. And he would have loved to have been here. Actually, he could have been here, but, you know, doctor's orders.
Of course.
So that's it. That's it. That's it for him.
No, that's good stuff. And it's good to hear that he's in good health. And, of course, it's very good to hear that he'll be back on Moats Extra this Wednesday.
100%.
Why don't you quickly tell the listeners and viewers how they can sign up to Moats Extra if they haven't already heard about this marvellous Wednesday show.
It looks a bit like Moats Extra, doesn't it?
It does just a little bit.
Just give it away. We are on Moats Extra as well. So it's very easy. $1 a show, as you said. And you just go to patreon.com/George Galloway. And that's it. You can also go on Facebook, but then you pay per show, which is fine. George Galloway under events.
How marvellous. And we've covered topics on Moats Extra that wouldn't usually get the airtime on Sunday Moats.
Correct.
We've had Kate Sheramani, who, of course, is an ex-nurse.
Or ex-patient.
Or ex-patient. COVID denier, who, of course, got sent to Ward 5, as we saw in the promotional clip earlier.
Yes.
And we've got some fantastic guests and topics coming up this week as well.
Correct.
I believe we're talking about 9/11 and
9/11
all
is
sorts
what
of things.
people have been really demanding. You know, they really want to get to the bottom of it. So does George, you know. So what really happened? 9/11.
Absolutely. No, it should be a fascinating show. Well, listen, we'll catch you later on Moats tonight. Gayatri will be presenting This Is the Week, or This Was the Week,
This
rather.
was the week, that's right.
So we look forward to seeing you again then. And we're, of course, very pleased to hear
Yes.
that George is in good health.
And you're doing marvellous,
We'll
James.
be back soon.
That's all I have to say as well
Bless you.
from George.
Well, bless you. He is watching, I do believe, as well. So if you have any calls, you want to send a message to George, he is listening in. Thank you, Mrs. Galloway. That was marvellous. Of course, they have just returned also from their trip to Scotland. So Gayatri is doing mighty fine there with her energy levels. I don't know how she does it with her young children as well. It's absolutely brilliant to have her with us. Coming up in the next hour on the mother of all talk shows, we'll be hearing from a former staffer of Jeremy Corbyn's about the scandal engulfing the Labour Party. We'll be hearing from Moats medic Dr Ranjit Brar about the impact the second national lockdown will have. Of course, Boris Johnson has made this announcement, this major U-turn, after for weeks proclaiming the local measures were working. There would be no national lockdown following. He, of course, called Keir Starmer Captain Hindsight. But surely, on the good ship Hindsight, Boris Johnson has emerged the new great captain. We'll be discussing this and more in the next hour. We'll be passing in just a moment to the news with Jamie Lowe. I am James Giles, and you are listening to the mother of all talk shows on Sputnik International across the United States, and also, of course, on the wonders of social media. We're on air until 10 p.m. London time, and if you want to talk to me, your supply teacher here this evening, the number is 0207 7982 255, or if you're in the States, 001 757 744 4480. Jamie should be joining us any moment now with the news.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
England's month-long lockdown could be extended beyond the 2nd of December if necessary, Cabinet Minister Michael Gove has said. The Tory frontbencher also defended the delay in reintroducing the nationwide restrictions, which had been called by the government's own scientific advisers back in September. He said tougher action was needed now because the situation has been worse than any of us expected, he said, and threatened to overwhelm the NHS. Pubs, bars, restaurants and non-essential retail will close from Thursday for 4 weeks across England, with furlough payments at 80% extended for the duration of the new measures. People will be allowed to exercise and socialise in public spaces outside with their household or one other person, but not indoors or in private gardens, and will be able to travel to work if they cannot work from home. People will be able to travel internationally for work, but will not be allowed to go abroad for holidays. Unlike the first lockdown, schools, universities and nurseries will remain open. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been accused by a former Conservative leader of giving in to the government's scientific advisers and marching England back into another lockdown. Ian Duncan Smith said that the second lockdown is a, quote, body blow to the British people. However, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer has said his party will vote in favour of the lockdown, meaning the government won't be defeated in the Commons. But a number of Conservative MPs have voiced their unhappiness and spoken out about the country going back into lockdown. Duncan Smith, who was Conservative leader from 2001 to 2003, said the lockdown comes just as the economy was picking up, even giving cause for optimism. A 70-year-old man has been rescued from a collapsed building in Turkey 34 hours after a major earthquake struck the country and Greece, killing at least 60 people and injuring 900 others. Ahmet Sitim said he never lost hope as he was pulled from the rubble in Turkey's third largest city, Izmir, according to a tweet by the health minister. Video footage shows rescuers cheering and clapping as Sitim was taken away on a stretcher to receive hospital treatment as searches continued in 9 buildings in Izmir. England World Cup winner and Manchester United legend Sir Bobby Charlton has been diagnosed with dementia. The news follows the deaths of his older brother Jack in July and fellow World Cup winner Nobby Stiles on Friday, both of whom had also been diagnosed with dementia. Charlton, aged 83, won 3 league titles, a European Cup and an FA Cup with United. During 17 years at Old Trafford, he scored 249 goals in 758 games for the club. Born in Ashton, Northumberland, he remained England's record goal scorer until Wayne Rooney surpassed him against Switzerland in September of 2015. At the age of 20, Sir Bobby was a survivor of the Munich air crash of 1958, in which 23 people died, including 8 of his Manchester United teammates. At least 4 people have died and nearly 350,000 are in evacuation centres as a super typhoon hit the Philippines. Goni, the world's strongest storm so far this year, made landfall in the southern Bicol region with sustained winds of 140 miles per hour and gusts of 174 miles per hour. The victims included one person who was reportedly hit by a tree and a 5-year-old who was washed away after a river overflowed in Albay province. Between 19 million and 31 million people could be affected by the typhoon, including those in danger zones and in Manila, the Disaster Management Agency have said. A replica noose in a voting station in Missouri has been covered up following complaints from Democrats that it constituted intimidation of black voters. The Missouri Democratic Party said the replica hangman's noose was a painful reminder of the murders and lynchings of black Americans. Stone County Clerk Cindy Elmore said the display, including the noose and photographs, had been in place for several years and was not related to the election. The replica noose marked the last execution by hanging in the state, which took place in Stone County in 1937. And finally, President Trump took time out from campaigning, where he made whistle-stop tours of 5 key battleground states to pay tribute to the Scottish actor Sir Sean Connery, whose death at the age of 90 was announced on Friday. Trump described him as quite a guy and a tough character, and said he had gone on to greener fairways before claiming that the actor had helped him get approval for a development in Scotland. Sean stepped in and shouted, "Let him build the damn thing," the president claimed. In 2018, British media reported that Trump had made a similar claim to the then UK Prime Minister Theresa May relating to approval for his Turnberry golf course in South Ayrshire. "I met James Bond and I got all my approvals," he was quoted as saying, adding, "James Bond was better than my approvals lawyer." In 2012, Mr. Trump made the Bond actor the first member of his golf club in Aberdeenshire. And that's the latest here on Sputnik News. I'm Jamie Lowe.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway, only on Sputnik Radio.
Welcome back to the mother of all talk shows, with me, James Giles, standing in this evening for George Galloway, who will be returning on Wednesday for Moats Extra and next Sunday for Moats. We're joined now by Professor Richard Wolff. Professor Wolff is a professor of economics. He's the author of Understanding Socialism, host of Economic Update, and co-founder of democracyatwork.info. Good morning, Professor. Are you with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Marvellous. Professor, I'm going to put you on the spot to start off with, if I may. Who will win on Tuesday and why?
Well, I'm afraid what's going to win is a declining American economic and political system. Everything is in place either for a contested outcome or for a level of social division and bitterness that no one living today can remember in American politics. If it existed, it's so long ago that it doesn't remain. No matter what the outcome in terms of which of these two wins, that kind of division, reflecting the difficulties this system is now in, that's the one certain outcome.
Well, for those of us tuning in who perhaps aren't aware of the Electoral College or how the American system works, because of course it is quite unique compared to many other parts of the world. Perhaps, could you enlighten us? The system is, of course, you can win the most votes but lose the election. How does that happen? Is it democratic?
It's very undemocratic. It's very different from what you have in most European countries. There, I believe you call it proportional representation. It's a basic democratic idea that if, say, for example, 10% of the people vote for a particular political party, then 10% of the seats in the parliament that engage in writing the laws and so on should come from that party to reflect that part of the population's perspective. We don't do that in the United States. Basically, the Constitution that governs all of this was written and organized by an elite The early years of the United States as an independent country, the vast majority of people did not have the right to vote. Women did not have the right to vote. People without property did not have the right to vote. Black people did not have the right to vote, and so on. And that has governed us even to this day. For example, the way the presidential game is played, in each of the 50 states, there will be a determination who the winner is. In this case, we know it'll be either Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden. Whichever one of those two individuals gets a majority of the votes, or even a plurality if there are more candidates, and in many states there are, whoever gets the largest number of votes will capture all of the electoral votes of that state. The loser, even if the loser gets 49.9% of the vote, will get absolutely no electoral votes. And the number of electoral votes depends on your population and the number of seats in the Senate and the House that your state has. So California and New York, for example, have many electoral votes. Wyoming and Mississippi have relatively few. And so if you win by large majorities in the states where you win, but you lose the majority of states, you can do what Mrs. Clinton did 4 years ago. You win the majority of the votes by actually 2 to 3 million. She was the winner, but she didn't win them in the right states to get the right electoral votes in the Electoral College, it's called, so that she lost the election. And that is exactly what can happen again. There are even more issues at play if there is a contested election, and Mr. Trump has been working extremely hard to develop a rationale for contesting the election, partly because of so many mail ballots due to the COVID. He can now claim whatever it is he wants, go into court. It works its way up the court system to the Supreme Court, which Mr. Trump has now packed, culminating in the seating of the last judge literally a week ago, so that he's hopeful, and we are all watching, whether he will play the game all the way through to the Supreme Court, and then we will have a spectacle in which the man who filled the seats in the court is declared president because the people he put in there return the favor and give him the decision of the highest court in the country. All of that we are now watching.
Sure. I mean, you speak about how Hillary Clinton, of course, last time managed to win the popular vote by quite some margin, but obviously lose that electoral college you've spoken about. And in 2016, perhaps, just perhaps, that was understandable, right? Trump being the outsider, Hillary, of course, wife of Bill, political establishment, and Trump playing that very populist narrative that he was this force and agent of change. But in his 4 years, Professor, Trump seems to have offended every section of the United States. Women, people of colour, perhaps with the one exception of the far right. He doesn't seem to have delivered in the Rust Belt states. So why still does Trump seem to have such an appeal to voters?
I think the basic answer, and I agree with everything you've just said, I think you're understanding us very well. The only thing I would add is that anger at the establishment remains strong. And Mr. Biden, as the vice president under Obama, and as obviously the choice of the establishment governing the Democratic Party, has to carry that burden. And that's what it is, on his shoulders. You know, when he gets up, Mr. Biden now, and says, vote for me because I'm not crazy the way Mr. Trump is, and I don't provoke the way Mr. Trump does, I will get us back to normal. I'm afraid that for huge numbers of the American people, it is crystal clear that normal is what was hurting them in the previous 30 years. Normal is why they broke with the establishment. Normal is why we have Mr. Trump. And I'm mystified, frankly, why the establishment is so tone deaf that they don't understand that they could have walked into this election unbeatable because of all that has gone wrong with Mr. Trump, but they chose to ride the horse that we are the establishment. We will bring us back to what we had before, when there's virtually no one in the country who wants that.
I mean, but surely, Professor, I mean, they may have gotten away with it if they'd have chosen someone with personality, charisma. You know, I mean, Mayor Pete Buttigieg, for instance, you know, is this young, although very much establishment-based figure that could at least claim to be a fresh voice or something. I mean, Biden, for all intents and purposes, if I was being kind, I would say he had a staggering problem. If I was being unkind, I'd say he was showing all of the symptoms of someone who frankly has dementia. You know, be it standing up saying, I am Joe Biden's husband, I've been in the Senate for 180 years, I'm Kamala Harris's running mate. I mean, am I making an unfair assessment here?
No, I think that the anxiety and the concern about that dimension of him is there. I think it's more that he is the establishment than that he is, you know, too old or too feeble to do the job. And I think that it's a sad comment that they didn't take any one of a number of people, including Bernie Sanders, who at this point, and this has been true for 6 months, is probably the most popular politician in the United States, in part because they threw him out. Yeah. The establishment would not tolerate him. But that means he's not tarred with the awful brushes that have painted the picture of Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden. The irony there, the twist of our fate as a nation should be powerfully underscored. Nor has anyone missed the message. You know, the establishment in this country allowed an extreme right-wing clownish figure like Mr. Trump to take over the Republican Party and to take over the presidency. And they have enabled it and they have allowed it. But the minute a moderate left-winger, and let me underscore, Bernie Sanders is very moderate. The minute a moderate left-winger got anywhere close, they all united to crush, exclude, and marginalize him. The world should take note that the growing difficulties of American capitalism, of the U.S. system, is teetering on the edge of cutting deals with the extreme right that ought to make everyone else stop, take a deep breath, and worry.
I think you're right in that, Professor. Obviously, in 2016, at the last presidential election, you had a relatively strong third-party candidate in Jill Stein of the Greens. You know, she had some national image following campaign, you know, at a time when, frankly, I don't think there's ever been two worse candidates for the so-called leadership of the free world. A time when a third-party candidate has been needed more. I mean, I can't put a cigarette paper between the policies on the whole of the two candidates. And so, Professor, why, in your opinion, hasn't a third-party candidate come forward for the role this time round?
Well, I think you have to understand that here in the United States, a fundamental deal was arrived at many, many decades ago. In a country that prides itself, literally all day, every day, telling itself that it is, quote unquote, a democracy, and that it is committed ultimately and totally to the notion of freedom of choice. We must have choice and freedom to choose. If you go into a pharmacy in this country, you can choose among 30 different kinds of toothpaste. If you go into a grocery store, you can choose among a bewildering number of soap powders or anything else. But when it comes to political parties, we don't seem to care about choice. We want to without being able to put that cigarette paper between them. This is a system that has been built up over many decades. It's a gentleman's agreement, with the word gentleman, please, in quotation marks, for 25 different reasons. It's a gentleman's agreement. You can have it for a few years, then please step aside so that I can have it for a few years, and then I'll return the favor. It won't make much difference. Half of the population in this country has watched this silly game and doesn't bother to vote in most elections. You have to give them a special reason to get a reasonable number of people to vote. That's not because they don't care. It's not because they're not civic-minded. None of that. It's because they observe that this is, as Bernie Sanders said, a completely rigged system. And to watch what happens when they play by the rules, the third-party people like Bernie, and they stay inside the party and they abide by the rules. No one is fooled. The establishment took one look at Bernie Sanders and went to work to destroy what he is doing, much as they're trying now, luckily so far without success, to destroy the younger versions, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the newly elected socialists who run as Democrats. By the way, I think it's coming to an end. I think the failure of these two parties to prevent the unbelievable collapse of this country's public health system in the face of this virus, put together with the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression of the 1930s, is showing the mass of the people that this system doesn't work for the vast majority. And among the things I suspect will go in the years ahead is this crazy system, electoral college and all the rest of it, designed to keep the mass of people away from exercising their suffrage.
Well, listen, it'll be a fascinating election, I'm sure. I will await the result with bated breath. I shall be staying up in the week. Professor, well, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Your insight has been fascinating, so thank you for that. I will be back in just a moment, hearing from Mrs. Galloway with That Was the Week.
Hello, mother of all talk shows.
Hello.
Yes?
Who is this?
Who are you trying to reach?
What number is this?
What number are you trying to reach?
I don't know.
Well, I think you have the wrong number.
Do I?
You do. Take it easy. Hi, mother of all talk shows.
Why don't you want to talk to me?
Who is this?
If you tell me your name, I'll tell you mine.
I don't think so.
What's that noise?
That's one of our jingles. We're in an ad break.
Really?
Look, you're being a nightmare. What do you want to talk about?
What's your worst nightmare?
Currently you?
Come on. What's your worst nightmare?
Well, the planet's on fire, the economy's ruined, social decency is dead, the north of England might as well be Europe, and I've just been declined universal credit. Hello?
George Galloway and the mother of all talk shows. Join us at the College of Knowledge, where there are no tuition fees.
This is the mother of all talk shows with me, James Giles, standing in for George Galloway. But we're not without a Galloway in the studio at the moment. I'm joined by Mrs. Galloway, Gayatri, here to present This Is the Week. Thank you, Gayatri.
Thank you, James. You're doing so well.
Bless you.
Right, so this is the part where usually George looks back at all the big events of this week. And to start off with, this was the day in 1970 when a fire at a nightclub in France killed 142 people, most of them teenagers. The club, a mile from the town of Saint-Laurent-du-Pont, near Grenoble, was packed with revelers when the fire started at around 1:45 local time, and the final death toll was 146. It emerged the nightclub, built 7 months previously, had never been inspected to see if it met fire safety regulations.
How terrible.
Sounds familiar?
Indeed. Only too familiar, sadly.
This was also the week when, in 1986, a U.S. hostage was freed in Beirut. David Jacobson, an American, had been held by Muslim extremists and was released after 17 months in captivity. And in 1995, the former South African Defense Minister, General Magnus Malan, was charged with murder. Malan was arrested with 10 other former senior military officers. They were charged with murdering 13 black people in 1987 as part of a conspiracy to create war between the African National Congress and the Zulu Inkatha Freedom Party. Eventually, the number charged rose to 20. All were acquitted after a trial in 1996. Then the general election in 1988 in Israel took place this week as well. It returned with a hung parliament with just 1 seat separating the main right and left-wing party in the Knesset. Yeah. Despite nearly 2 weeks of negotiations, deep divisions within the ultra-Orthodox parties dashed Yitzhak Shamir's hopes of forming a government without Labour. By the end of the month, another national unity government had been formed, with Likud at the head and Labour occupying key cabinet positions. In 1990, the coalition government lost a no-confidence vote. On the 3rd of November in 1957, this week, the Soviet Union launched the first ever living creature into the cosmos.
Really?
Wow. Do you know who it was? It was the dog called Laika. And this was before the rise of the animal liberation movement, seriously. Laika did not survive. It's funny because a few years ago we went to an exhibition of the cosmonauts, and we bought one of these Laika souvenirs. So Laika with its suit is still living in our household.
How lovely.
Then Lyndon Baines Johnson, better known as LBJ, was elected president of the US in 1964, defeating hardline Republican Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona by an overwhelming majority. In 1975, North Sea oil began to flow into Britain when the Queen formally turned the wheel on the operation of the UK's first oil pipeline at a ceremony in Scotland. So the 130-mile pipeline from Cruden Bay to Grangemouth was built by British Petroleum. This is also traditionally, of course, the election week in the US, and in 2004, George W. Bush won a second term as President of the United States, beating his Democratic rival, John Kerry, by a very comfortable margin, of course. And the final result was 286 Electoral College for Bush, while John Kerry won 252. Now, dialing back a few decades to 1956, this was the week when Soviet Air Force bombed parts of the Hungarian capital, Budapest. And Russian troops poured into the city in a massive dawn offensive. The Soviet invasion was a response to the national uprising led by the Prime Minister Imre Nagy, who had promised the Hungarian people independence and political freedom. Nagy and others involved in the revolution were secretly tried and executed in June '58. Wow. The Soviet troops finally withdrew from Hungary in 1991. Of course, continuing on the US elections, in 1980, the former Hollywood actor and Republican governor of California, Ronald Reagan, was elected as the president of the US state, defeating the incumbent Jimmy Carter. The final results showed Reagan won 489 and the Democrats 49.
It was a landslide that year. Absolute landslide.
So, also this week was the Israeli minister Yitzhak Rabin, who was assassinated in '95. He was shot 3 times at close range in the stomach and chest by a far-right assailant as he left a peaceful rally in Tel Aviv.
How sad.
He was taken into the hospital where he later died. Back to the USA, where in 1952, General Dwight Eisenhower swept to victory in the American presidential election with the largest then number of popular votes ever recorded for a presidential candidate. He gained 31,552,768. Mind-boggling numbers.
A lot of votes.
He won in 38 states, so it was very, very impressive. This gave him 431 electoral college votes, which was significantly more than the 266 he needed for a majority. Also, going to the south of Americas, Nicaragua's ruling Sandinista front claimed a decisive victory in '84 in the country's first election since the revolution 5 years earlier. And within the hours of count beginning, the leader of the country's left-wing junta, Daniel Ortega, said he had gained nearly 70% of the vote in the election. In spite of the Sandinista victory being declared fair, the US, unsurprisingly, continued to oppose and actively undermine the left-wing Nicaraguan government. Up to date. In 1991, this is a subject close to us, and if George was here, he would go further into it. The body of the millionaire newspaper and publisher Robert Maxwell was found in the sea off the coast of Tenerife. He drowned after he fell or was pushed off his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, named after his daughter, of course, now a prisoner in the US.
Of course.
It emerged that the Mirror Group's debts vastly outweighed its assets, and $440 million was missing from the company's pension fund. And that's not pocket money, that. And in 1996, after an 8-month trial, his sons Kevin and Ian Maxwell and another man, Larry Trachtenberg, were cleared of conspiracy to defraud the Mirror Group pensioners. Of course, back to the presidential election in the US, in 1996, Bill Clinton, the comeback kid, was basking in a resounding victory over Republican Bob Dole and the prospect of 4 more years. I've never even heard of Bob Dole. That's how resounding his comeback was.
Dole says Bob Dole should have won.
He was the first Democratic president in the US history to be re-elected since Roosevelt, taking 49.2% of the popular vote. During the 8 years of Clinton's presidency, the economy expanded by 50% in real terms. And by the end of his tenure, the US had a gross national product of $10,000 billion, 1/4 of the entire world's economic output. 1/4. His second term was, of course, dogged by the Monica Lewinsky sex scandal. As he put it, I did not have sex with that woman.
He was, of course, impeached. There was impeachment proceedings.
There's more. Just a few bit more. In 1987, 45 oil workers were killed after a Chinook helicopter carrying the workers from an old rig plunged into the North Sea off the coast of Scotland. 47 people were on board the helicopter, which was a 130-mile flight from the Brent Field, northeast of Shetland. 2 were rescued. The cause of the accident was subsequently found to be a gearbox failure. Back again to the US election week in '56, Dwight Eisenhower, yes, him again, he was returned to the White House with the biggest share of votes for 100 years. And in 1972, President Nixon, a.k.a. Tricky Dicky, won a landslide in the elections for a second term, defeating the Democrat George McGovern.
Wow.
It wasn't to last long, though, of course. He was forced to resign in disgrace over Watergate, implicated in the burgeoning of the Democrats' HQ. I'm actually watching a series at the moment with George, which includes this whole scandal. Yeah, that was it, actually. There you
go. What a week. That was a week. Gayatri, thank you very much indeed for that.
You're welcome, James.
That's been marvellous. Thank you. We're joined now by a good friend of mine, in fact, Dr. Phil Bevan. Dr. Bevan is a former advisor in the leader of the opposition's office under Jeremy Corbyn. Good evening, Phil. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Thank you very much, James. I can hear you.
Marvellous.
I think, to be fair, it was a little bit grand, but yes, I did work in Jeremy's office in Westminster.
Well, listen, we've been doing a poll this evening on the mother of all talk shows, which can be found on George's Twitter page. In light of the report which was published this week, we wanted to ask, what is Labour's greatest shame? We have 3 options: anti-Semitism, the Iraq War and NHS privatisation. Thousands of people have voted in this poll so far, and we have seen a massive swing since the last time I announced it here on Moats. Anti-Semitism is down 6 points. Only 5% of our listeners think anti-Semitism is Labour's greatest shame. NHS privatisation is down 7. Only 7% say NHS privatisation. Perhaps unsurprisingly, 88% of our listeners, up 13, say it was Blair's invasion of Iraq, which was Labour's greatest shame. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. I think your listeners are very smart. I mean, the Iraq War, the death toll for the Iraq War is about, between 2003 and 2006, was about 650,000 Iraqis. The war destabilised the entire region. It set a terrible precedent for aggressive interventions by Western powers outside of the UN. It's absolutely catastrophic. It's a stain on the Labour Party, and actually, to Jeremy's credit, one of the great things that he did as leader was that he apologised in the House of Commons for the Iraq War, and obviously that didn't go down well with everybody in the party, but it was a significant moment, and I think actually we should all be very, very grateful for that, because it is all important that it's always important that we look at our history, what's gone on, and we learn from it and we try to correct it. And that's one of the things that Jeremy's always been very good at. I think your audience is also right about the PFI initiatives and NHS privatisation coming next. That was, again, it was a terrible precedent to set. And I think now during the coronavirus crisis, we are seeing the after effects of that. The kind of PFI initiatives that really started, I mean, I think they originally started under John Major, but Blair advanced, were turbocharged by David Cameron, and they've been going ever since. And we're kind of seeing it, the end game play out now, where our NHS, our health system, just isn't capable of dealing with a widespread national crisis. It's absolutely tragic, and it needs to be reversed. And of course, Jeremy would have done that had he been Prime Minister. So the result of the 2019 general election is a great shame. Of course, with regards to anti-Semitism, there is an issue in the Labour Party. There is an issue in wider UK society. It's worth pointing out that I think it's less than 1% of members have been accused or suspended or expelled on grounds of anti-Semitism. So although it does exist in the party, I don't think anyone would dispute that. It is by no means institutional. It's certainly not institutional within the party. It exists, but it's certainly not Labour's greatest shame. Labour's greatest shame, I would say, is the Iraq War.
No, that's interesting. Now, of course, the media like to portray the former leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, in a certain light. And that light, I think it's fair to say, is not usually a positive one. So from a man that's been in the thick of it all, at the heart of Westminster, what's your take on working for Jeremy Corbyn, who, the media would portray, if I was being kind, I think, as a Marmite figure?
Yeah, he actually had a jar of Marmite in his office with his name on it. There was also a story in, I can't remember, it was in one of the papers about how he used to eat cold beans or something like that. So once when he had a meeting, he brought in tins of cold baked beans, which the guy's got a great sense of humour. He's the thing that doesn't come through of media report. Well, there's lots of things that don't come through about Jeremy in media reports, but Jeremy, as I know him, the real Jeremy, is actually incredibly knowledgeable about everything from the history of the British Railways to international politics. He is very politically astute, and he listens to people, and he's interested in ordinary people as well. He's absolutely dedicated constituency MP. and all of his politics. He's not a dogmatic socialist, as some people would like to portray him, but he's absolutely grounded in human rights and the needs and wishes of ordinary people, which is why he listens. And it's also why he took the time to talk to me, just a junior member of staff. Not every politician who came through Lotto would condescend to talk to the likes of me. Keir Starmer certainly didn't, but Jeremy had a very good relationship with Jeremy. You could talk to him about anything really. But yeah, he was a fantastic boss and very diligent, very competent. And what he really was somebody who would resolve conflicts and not seek to stoke them, and wouldn't put people against each other. He would always try and bring people together, which I think, if you're judging his leadership fairly, you'd have seen quite a lot of that.
Well, look, there's a great irony, isn't there? And I think you spoke about how Corbyn wasn't this hardline socialist. As to be fair, the media did portray him for a long time, and there's a great irony that, especially over the Brexit issue, he was the last of the compromisers, if you like. He was the last one to say, we're not going to advocate second referendum, we're not going to advocate hard Brexit, and sort of take that middle line. And that was never really communicated in the press, was it?
No, I don't think it was. I think the problem, and I obviously wasn't involved in the high-level discussions here, but one of the things that Jeremy said in an interview he did for Middle East Eye with Peter Oborne, which captured kind of my feelings at the time in the office, is that Jeremy was the one who was trying to bring everybody together to come up with a coherent position on Brexit that would satisfy the British people. Initially, obviously, in 2017, that was respecting the result of the referendum, which was 52-48 in favour of leave. I personally think that had that position maintained, then Labour would have done a lot better in the 29 election. But it was, there were people who were going off on various different shows and actually not towing the official party line, the real party line, which Jeremy set down. And I think that was a big problem, but the problem wasn't Jeremy's, because he was straining every sinew to make sure that people came together and fought for the big picture.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, Jeremy wanted to make sure that in terms of the Labour Party and what the Labour Party was putting forward, it didn't obsess over Brexit. And it focused on the issues that actually matter to most people in terms of the effects of austerity on communities, anything to like local bus services. If you live in a rural area, the cuts to local bus services have a massive impact on your life.
Of course.
And because he was interested in people, he understood all of that. Unfortunately, because of the Brexit issue, we didn't always get as much focus on that from the mainstream media as we would have liked. And that's a great shame, actually.
I mean, look, Jonathan Ashworth this week, who of course served as Shadow Health Secretary under both Jeremy Corbyn's leadership and now under that of Sir Keir Starmer, of course has described anti-Semitism as Labour's greatest shame. Hence our poll. Obviously, you've worked in the Leader of the Opposition's office. In your time there, and in your time as a Labour member, have you ever experienced or witnessed any anti-Semitic behaviour?
I have never witnessed any anti-Semitic behaviour whatsoever when working with Jeremy Corbyn in his office and with his staff team. Quite the opposite. My impression, and it's not just my impression, my experience, my direct experience of being in meetings where they're talking about the subject, is genuine concern for the well-being and indeed the feelings of Jewish communities across the UK. And yeah, real concern and a desire to implement processes, robust processes that would allow the Labour Party to deal with that properly. There was at no point was there any suggestion that Jeremy, Carrie Murphy, or anybody on the staff team was suggesting that anti-Semitism within the Labour Party was something to be taken lightly. Quite the opposite, in fact. So everybody took it very seriously. And of course, there were Jewish members of staff who were expressing their own concerns. So this is something that we're all very aware of and very sensitive to, and took very, very seriously. In terms of experiencing anti-Semitism within the Labour Party more broadly, within the membership, yeah, I have experienced some of it. I have seen some of it. So it's not, I don't think it's prevalent, but it certainly does exist. And I think it exists where people are a bit ignorant about certain things, perhaps over kind of international issues like the Israel-Palestine dispute. But it's certainly something that, rather than some people think that Jeremy was somehow he didn't really understand the issue. That's completely untrue. Jeremy is absolutely dedicated to tackling racism and anti-Semitism, and that's the truth of his leadership.
This presents, though, surely a massive headache to Sir Keir Starmer. I mean, Sir Keir has paid off the Labour whistleblowers in the Panorama documentary, to the tune of over £500,000. The party is not particularly flush. Unite the Union, one of the unions reducing its contributions to the Labour Party. All reports would have it that Labour membership is on the decline. On the other side, of course, you have Jeremy Corbyn, who, not himself, but supporters through crowdfunding, have raised over £300,000 for a legal fighting fund. I mean, this will surely present a massive headache to the new leadership promised by Sir Keir Starmer, won't it?
Yeah, I don't think it needs to. I think, to be honest with you, my personal view is that they've made a really big mistake here in suspending Jeremy. They haven't actually clarified specifically under what provision of the rule book they've done it. And I think that's a real problem. And I think there's a really easy way out of it, which is to reverse the suspension and to apologise to him for any damage that's been done to his reputation. Because I think, frankly, there's been enough damage to his reputation done over the past few years. He's a very good man, and he's been very good to me personally. And I think how he's been treated is appalling. So I think a little bit of restitution is in order here. I think that the leadership should step back and just say, look, we made a mistake. We want to go forward. We want to bring people together, and we recognise that we were wrong, and we would like to apologise to Jeremy and welcome him back into the fold unconditionally, and with his reputation not only intact but enhanced.
I mean, from the description you've given me of your time working for Jeremy, it sounds like the sort of thing that Jeremy might just agree to if it was offered to him. I mean, you've painted a picture of Jeremy as as we've said, the last of the compromisers, but also as a relatively decent chap, I think. It certainly seems a reasonable offer, doesn't it? Sir Keir Starmer, if you're listening, take note, is what I would say to that.
I can't speak for Jeremy. I don't know what he's thinking about things at the moment at all. I just speak for for myself and what I think seems reasonable and what I think seems fair. And I actually, just from a personal point of view, I'd also like to say that I'm really disappointed doesn't quite cut it, but astounded now that we're in the middle of a national crisis, a national health crisis, and the current leadership has decided to prioritise attacking Jeremy for reasons that to all of us seem remarkably unclear. I don't see why they've done it. Why aren't they attacking the Conservatives? Why aren't they holding them to account over this catastrophe?
Absolutely. No, listen, Dr. Bevin, thank you very much indeed for your time. It's been incredibly useful. Thank you for coming on the Mother of All Talk Shows. It's been marvellous.
No problem. Yeah, thank you, James.
We move over to the lines now. The phones are working again, I'm pleased to say. Keep your social media comments coming in on air at moats.tv, George Galloway on Twitter, Facebook, and Moats on Facebook and Twitter. And of course, you can phone in. The number, if you're in Britain, is 0207 798 2255. Or if you're in the States, 001 757 744 4480. Ian in Hounslow is now finally on the line. Go ahead, Ian.
Good evening, James.
Good evening.
Best wishes to George, by the way.
Absolutely.
Now, the reason I'm phoning in is because of the COVID-19 lockdown that's been warned about by Mr. Johnson. Now, we've got a right-wing sort of reaction from lobbying groups, and they're reviving the herd immunity idea in the UK. Now, there's a group known as the Let It Rippers, and they comprise of Professor Carol Sikora, the oncologist, who's a real right-winger, a neoliberal.
Yes.
With him, you've got Sam Williams of the Economic Insight Consultancy.
Yeah.
Because we know they're nice and left-wing and for the people, don't we, these consultancies. Professor Sumetra Gupta, who was quoted, she's an epidemiologist, by the way, quoted on LBC as saying lockdowns just kick the can down the road, and she's worried about the poor. Now, I don't know if anybody's worried about the poor, why they're associating themselves with these two characters. So I really don't trust her at all. Now, I tried to phone LBC to counter this narrative, and they're call screening.
Oh, really? How fascinating.
Yes, they're call screen, and the presenters are on a neoliberal rant because they're seeing the whole neoliberal globalist world melt in front of their eyes under COVID, and they're trying to kick up any smoke screen to hide it. Now, we are where we are because Johnson refused to act when he should have done in March. Because we are an island, James.
Yeah.
There's no reason why we couldn't have. But all these people were coming back from abroad with their suitcases full of money, doing their international deals, bringing C-19 with them. And that's why we're in this situation.
Yeah, well, look, Ian, Australia have closed the ports, have closed the airports, and now, of course, we're seeing that they are reporting no new COVID cases today, in fact, in many parts of Australia now for many days. And so they are now looking to loosen restrictions, but that's because, obviously, of the work they've taken in order to do that. I mean, what do you make of the call from Sir Keir Starmer for the circuit breaker? I mean, should Boris have listened to Sir Keir when he made those calls initially?
Well, anybody, never mind him, but anybody, he should have been listening to anybody. But they keep saying there's no exit strategy. Do you hear him saying, well, if there's a lockdown, there's no exit strategy? Have you heard that said, James?
Yeah, it's certainly been in the media. You've got the hawks in the government, the Rishi Sunaks of this world, saying, we need to get on with the economy, and obviously the doves, Hancock, Gove, saying, we've got to protect lives, and it's a really difficult one. But obviously the impromptu nature, I think, Ian, by which Boris Johnson called the press conference and then, of course, kept the public waiting, even going into, the valuable hours of Strictly Come Dancing, which is one way, surely, to anger a very large part of the nation, I think just shows how on the cuff, on the hoof, the government's strategy has been. I mean, wouldn't you agree?
Yes, but there is an exit strategy. We need a coalition government. George has been calling for this for ages. We also need international cooperation between all governments. Forget your petty rivalries. We all need to develop and distribute this vaccine internationally through the World Health Organization. And the interests of the money men and the shareholders of Big Pharma need to be brushed aside. And that's what's holding it up, James. Mark my words.
That's fascinating stuff. Ian, thank you very much indeed. Chris is on the line from Hong Kong. Can give perhaps a global perspective. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, how are you this evening, James? Good to talk to you.
I'm not too bad, thank you, sir.
Just before I say anything, may I say, Gigi's shoes are very large to fill, and you're not doing a bad job, old bean. So
that's most kind of you, sir. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay. Well, I rang in this evening. We've just covered the ground. I think Mr. Bevin has covered some of the ground I wanted to cover, but I was spitting my gunny, shall I say, which is an Australian saying, or New Zealander saying, with regards what Mr. Christie came out with his political analysis of what Starmer's been up to this week. Now, I think anybody who knows me, and it's Chris Torvine, and yes, I may be in Hong Kong, but regrettably, I know more what's going on in my own little village in Wales than I do here in Hong Kong of late. But that's the internet for you. It's a brilliant thing. So there is a lot going on within the Labour movement. There's a considerable amount of anger with Starmer, and I actually find Starmer incompetent. I don't believe for an instant anymore that Starmer would do a better job at coping with the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic than what Johnson has. And the reason why I say this is quite straightforward. 4 weeks ago, Starmer was on TV demanding schools in the north close. Schools are dangerous. It's a transmission route, which it is, by the way. That's why we closed them here in Hong Kong. Today, oh no, let's not close schools. Let's keep them open. But of course, 3 weeks ago, I was calling for a lockdown. He hasn't called for a lockdown. There is no lockdown if you don't shut education. How can there be? So let's be honest about it. That's just the first problem. Also, anyone who's been associated with the Labour Party for the past 5 or 6 years is fully aware that the right has wanted to take out Corbyn since July 2015.
Yeah.
Okay? They've just wanted to take him out.
No, absolutely.
And of course...
I mean, Chris, you know, what I would say is Keir Starmer, I think, is bringing a whole new definition to both opposition and also being the leader of the Labour Party. You know, it's staggering how when the unions are calling for the schools to close, that is, of course, the time when Keir Starmer says, no, we must keep them open. And then, of course, you know, even with this vote on Wednesday in Parliament, despite the rebellion from the Tory backbenches, you know, the lockdown is set to pass, of course, because the leader of Her Majesty's opposition, so-called, of course, is just backing the government every single time.
Yes, he's in lockstep with the Prime Minister. End of story. He should not be, but he is. There's no opposition there. But my biggest pun against him is basically the reality that he's had more than 6 months to orchestrate the removal of Mr. Corbyn, which was the plan all along. This is a long-term plan they've had. Make no mistake about this. And yet, when it comes to the push, it's a complete and utter cock-up. And you've seen him wriggle like a worm. Wriggle like a worm on TV when he's questioned about it. And then we had his deputy, Miss Rayner, wriggle and scream when she says what Mr. Corbyn said was 100% the truth. But you're not allowed to tell the truth anymore. What rabbit hole have we delved into?
Indeed.
What hallucinogenic drugs are these people consuming? Because I'll tell you what, they're dangerous, and I will tell my daughter to avoid them. So,
Yes,
no,
it's
don't think governance will be better with Starmer. And don't think Starmer will win the 24 election. He won't. Anyone who wishes to write the Tory party off at this juncture in time is a blithering idiot. And I'll tell you why.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Go ahead.
Too often, they were written off in the latter part of the 20th century when we had Blairism at its height. And guess what? They've come back. They've managed to win, 4 elections now, and I think they will get an unprecedented 5th election come 24. Of course, they'll get rid of Bojo, and they'll have someone more agreeable in. Bojo is now the fall guy. That's his role. Starmer is a non-entity. Nasal Starmer. He sounds awful even on the radio and on the TV. He's useless. Sorry, mate.
No,
that's my
not at all,
opinion.
Chris. Thank you very much indeed for that call and for your take on that. It's much appreciated. Just as a reminder, of course, the lines are open. The number is 0207 7982 255 in the UK, or in the States, 001 757 744 4480. The final poll results of our first Malts poll this evening are in. What is Labour's greatest shame? Thousands of you have voted on George's Twitter. Anti-Semitism ends up at a measly 3%, down 2. NHS privatisation, 5%, down 1. And up hugely from the start of the poll this evening, the Iraq War at 92%, up 2. That's a fascinating turnaround there from when we launched the poll, when all three were in double digits. You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with me, James Giles. I'm standing in this evening for George Galloway. George isn't here this week. He has an operation in the morning, so doctor's orders, he's got an early night. He'll be back on Wednesday, though, for Moats Extra. You can sign up for that at patreon.com/George Galloway. Dr. Ranjit Brar will be joining me in the next hour to talk about the new lockdown in England. And coming up next is the news with Jamie Lowe.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
England's month-long lockdown could be extended beyond the 2nd of December if necessary, Cabinet Minister Michael Gove has said. The Tory frontbencher also defended the delay in reintroducing the nationwide restrictions, which had been called by the government's own scientific advisers back in September. He said tougher action was needed now because the situation has been worse than any of us expected, he said, and threatened to overwhelm the NHS. Pubs, bars, restaurants and non-essential retail will close from Thursday for 4 weeks across England, with furlough payments at 80% extended for the duration of the new measures. People will be allowed to exercise and socialise in public spaces outside with their household or one other person, but not indoors or in private gardens, and will be able to travel to work if they cannot work from home. People will be able to travel internationally for work, but will not be allowed to go abroad for holidays. Unlike the first lockdown, schools, universities and nurseries will remain open. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been accused by a former Conservative leader of giving in to the government's scientific advisers and marching England back into another lockdown. Ian Duncan-Smith said that the second lockdown is a, quote, body blow to the British people. However, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer has said his party will vote in favour of the lockdown, meaning the government won't be defeated in the Commons. But a number of Conservative MPs have voiced their unhappiness and spoken out about the country going back into lockdown. Duncan-Smith, who was Conservative leader from 2001 to 2003, said the lockdown comes just as the economy was picking up, even giving cause for optimism. A 70-year-old man has been rescued from a collapsed building in Turkey 34 hours after a major earthquake struck the country and Greece, killing at least 60 people and injuring 900 others. Ahmet Sitim said he never lost hope as he was pulled from the rubble in Turkey's third largest city, Izmir, according to a tweet by the health minister. Video footage shows rescuers cheering and clapping as Sitim was taken away on a stretcher to receive hospital treatment as searches continued in 9 buildings in Izmir. England World Cup winner and Manchester United legend Sir Bobby Charlton has been diagnosed with dementia. The news follows the deaths of his older brother Jack in July and fellow World Cup winner Nobby Stiles on Friday, both of whom had also been diagnosed with dementia. Charlton, aged 83, won 3 league titles, a European Cup and an FA Cup with United during 17 years at Old Trafford. He scored 249 goals in 758 games for the club. Born in Ashton, Northumberland, he remained England's record goal scorer until Wayne Rooney surpassed him against Switzerland in September of 2015. At the age of 20, Sir Bobby was a survivor of the Munich air crash of 1958, in which 23 people died, including 8 of his Manchester United teammates. At least 4 people have died and nearly 350,000 are in evacuation centres as a super typhoon hit the Philippines. Goni, the world's strongest storm so far this year, made landfall in the southern Bicol region with sustained winds of 140 miles per hour and gusts of 174 miles per hour. The victims included one person who was reportedly hit by a tree and a 5-year-old who was washed away after a river overflowed in Albay province. Between 19 million and 31 million people could be affected by the typhoon, including those in danger zones and in Manila, the Disaster Management Agency have said. A replica noose in a voting station in Missouri has been covered up following complaints from Democrats that it constituted intimidation of black voters. The Missouri Democratic Party said the replica hangman's noose was a painful reminder of the murders and lynchings of black Americans. Stone County Clerk Cindy Elmore said the display, including the noose and photographs, had been in place for several years and was not related to the election. The replica noose marked the last execution by hanging in the state, which took place in Stone County in 1937. And finally, President Trump took time out from campaigning, where he made whistle-stop tours of 5 key battleground states to pay tribute to the Scottish actor Sir Sean Connery, whose death at the age of 90 was announced on Friday. Trump described him as quite a guy and a tough character and said he had gone on to greener fairways before claiming that the actor had helped him get approval for a development in Scotland. Sean stepped in and shouted, "Let him build the damn thing," the president claimed. In 2018, British media reported that Trump had made a similar claim to the then UK Prime Minister Theresa May relating to approval for his Turnberry golf course in South Ayrshire. "I met James Bond and I got all my approvals," he was quoted as saying, adding, "James Bond was better than my approvals lawyer." In 2012, Mr. Trump made the Bond actor the first member of his golf club in Aberdeenshire. And that's the latest here on Sputnik News. I'm Jamie Lowe.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
This is the mother of all talk shows. Welcome back. You're joining me, James Giles, standing in this evening for George Galloway, who has an operation in the morning, so doctor's orders, has an early night. Now, in just a moment, we'll be talking to a doctor of our own, Dr. Ranjit Brar. But before that, our second poll of the evening has been launched. Who will win the US presidential election on Tuesday? Will it be Joe Biden or will it be Donald Trump? That is live now on George's Twitter page, @George Galloway. So go and check it out. And we'll be updating you with the results of that before the end of the evening. Boris Johnson, of course, has announced a supposed month-long national lockdown, second lockdown now. Some people are calling it Tier 4, others going for the more typical lockdown, saying we'll be talking for a slightly extended period of time this evening in light of the announcement. To our MOTS medic, Dr. Ranjit Brar, who joins me now on the line. Good evening, Ranjit, how are you?
James, good to be with you. I'm very well, thank you. And if I can just say, though it's great to speak to you, James, we have met before. I'm very sorry to hear that George is unwell, though it's very reassuring to see him in that message in the beginning, actually looking fighting fit. So I give him my best for a routine procedure and a speedy recovery, and send my love to Gatra and the family as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm very pleased, of course, to say that George is expected to be back here presenting MOTS Extra on Wednesday. So it should only be a short absence. Dr. Brar, is this lockdown the way to go? I mean, should we be doing more, less? Is it too late? What's your take on it?
I was just going to start with that question straight
Let's
off the
go
bat.
straight in.
I think it's a reasonable question. It's the question on everyone's lips.
It is indeed.
I think, we've been saying for some time, I've said to George before, the whole nation, the world really is suffering from COVID fatigue. It's a peculiarity of this disease that it's so innocuous to the vast majority, and particularly to the young. We know that no one under 20 no one under 11 without very serious comorbidities anyway has succumbed to the virus. It's essentially of no consequence to them. But of course, it is of consequence when they get it and spread it to others. And we know that in the elderly, particularly in the over 60s, particularly in the comorbid population, even more so in the over 80s group, this is a very serious disease, and it's still a matter of debate. So much, is constantly published about COVID, but the data on the world scale is different in different places, and nations have handled it in very different ways. It's still a matter of debate what the true mortality rate is, and people tend to pick the figure that they think most conforms to their general feeling about how our policy should be. I probably think that the mortality rate is at least 0.7, maybe as high as 1.5% of the people who get it. And now, if we look currently on a world scale of test-proven cases, there's a huge rate of increase at the moment. So in the world, there's getting on for 47 million people have had coronavirus proven by testing. It'll be a larger number who've actually had it. 1.2 million deaths. But look at the spike that we're seeing now. In the United States, within the last 2 weeks, 1 million people have freshly contracted and tested positive for the virus. In the United Kingdom, we're getting more than 20 to 25,000 cases a day. We've gone past the 1 million barrier. The United States has gone past the 9.5 million barrier. India, 8 million. Brazil, 5.5 million. Many countries in Europe are experiencing this second wave. The United States, it really never went away. So, how do we handle that situation? It's of note that 2-3 weeks ago, the Great Barrington Declaration was published. These are three really kind of leading epidemiologists who have said that, in their opinion, lockdown is incredibly harmful. Well, lockdown is harmful. We know that lockdown is harmful, but of course, the effects of the virus are harmful also. So I am not someone who thinks actually that it's possible to simply, what they essentially ask for is shielding rather than a general lockdown. You lock down the vulnerable. Don't make everyone suffer, just make the most vulnerable and the elderly suffer. But what I do think is they haven't proven and they haven't shown in any way is how you achieve that. How, if it becomes generally prevalent, coronavirus, in the population, you shield the elderly group. And we're seeing currently that as the figures are rising, and I can talk you through some of the figures, I think we're all a bit figured out. Everyone is so full of data, and I can spout data at you, but it's unquestionably the case, to summarize it, that there's a huge spike going on right now. It's spreading throughout all the age groups, despite the fact that the elderly are trying to shield themselves. They are becoming increasingly affected. That hospitalizations are increasing, and they're back to our kind of April level, not quite the peak of March. And at the moment, we're still seeing a doubling of cases, of admissions and deaths every 2 weeks. So that last week, if I added up the deaths, as a kind of morbid activity that I have to go through, mainly to keep you guys informed. But really, last week, there were 1,166 deaths. So a large increase, when we had been seeing weeks where there were kind of 100 and less, days when there were almost zero. And this week has gone up to closer to the 1,900 deaths. So these rates of deaths are still doubling every 2 weeks. These, of course, are relatively small numbers of deaths compared to the total numbers of deaths of the population. But these are happening in addition, and we are moving back into the territory where we're going to see, again, excess mortality. And if we look at the figures for the accurate figures of excess mortality associated with the pandemic, and of course that slightly disguises the distinction between the people who are strictly dying of COVID and people who are dying of all of the societal changes that have gone along with the crisis, impoverishment and comorbidities, not receiving healthcare, then they're probably talking about 80 to 90,000 people already, James.
All right, but let me play devil's advocate for a minute, if I may. We've had a few people this evening, obviously knowing you're coming on the show as you usually do, say, well, look, we don't want to conform with these new rules. The average age of a COVID death, so they say, perhaps you can verify, is 82.4. We shouldn't be doing a full lockdown. Really and truly, we should just be sheltering the very old and letting everybody else just get on with day-to-day life. I mean, that's what some of our social media comments are saying. You're the medic. What do you have to say to that?
I think, how I feel personally and how I feel professionally and, looking at the data. I think we have to constantly look at the data, see how it evolves and be guided by it. I think, at the entrance at the entrance to science, we have to say, here lies all prejudice. So we have to look. The truth is our ally in this. We have to look at the data and we have to, draw our policy from this. What I find amazing in the current debate is that if I really am honest with you, I think that the lockdown is a sign of failure. It's a sign of failure of the government to adequately deal with this problem, and it didn't have to be this way. We are dealing with an infective pathogen. We can talk about the characteristics of that pathogen, and we can, obviously lament the fact that it's a new virus that is extremely infective and it's spreading around the world at a very rapid rate. But all countries are not suffering in the way that we are and the United States are, and it's indelibly linked to me, not just to the nature of the pathogen, but the nature of the society in which we live, the inequality within our society, and the way in which our healthcare is suffering. Our healthcare, and in all things, we are following the United States. The United States has a fully insurance-based system that leaves tens of millions, probably now as many as 70 million people in the United States without access to healthcare. Whilst the slogan of this government constantly is protect the NHS, stop it being overwhelmed, what they're really doing is flattening a curve, but it will carry on at a very large rate. And it's taking this huge toll precisely because all of the track and trace measures, which were so effectively used. China is not in the narrative now. China at the beginning was all over the narrative because it was about propaganda point scoring in a global political war that our country is constantly fighting for economic domination along with the United States. And so they were gleefully pointing at this as a sign of the poor governance of China. This was just another tool in their arsenal to attack China. Then they blame China for the virus. Now they don't mention China. They don't mention China because if you look at the Chinese are not having a second wave. The Chinese have reopened their economy. We're allowed to point to New Zealand. We're allowed to point to South Korea, but no one mentions, like China suddenly doesn't exist in this regard. China's not having a second wave. China still has 85,000 cases. China still has 4,000 deaths. That's the same as if you'd asked me in February. So in that time, the United Kingdom has had over 1 million test-proven cases, probably 4 million actual cases, and all the deaths and all the problems we have, and we're facing a second lockdown. Wuhan football team, are playing matches. They're having concerts in the street. The concept that it's some kind of utopia to deal with an illness is simply not true. It's a question of how you deal with it, whether you mobilize the resources of your nation, economic resources, medical resources, in order to put the health of people first as opposed to the profit of business first. What really kicked our government into action wasn't hitting the pandemic on the head. What really kicked them into action in terms of their economic package was the financial crisis that hit, which was linked but was not synonymous. Okay, it was triggered, but it was happening anyway. It was deepened in its severity, but the economic crisis was happening anyway. And many of the social effects that people point to when they say this is the effect of lockdown, what they're really looking at is they're pointing at the economic crisis of overproduction, which is systemic in capitalism, which happens every 10 years, which we experienced in 2008. They're looking at poverty. They're looking at, and also the fact, so they're looking at that. They're also looking at the fact that our NHS, far from being protected, has been systematically attacked and privatized. And it was very instructive, not just to note that there's a reduction of capacity by half of NHS beds over the last 30 years under Tory and Labour administrations alike. It was really instructive. It came to my attention this week that in Basingstoke, a group of GPs was being criticised by their local council because they had signed an agreement with Operose. Operose is an anodyne-sounding name. Operose, it turns out, is essentially the UK operations of Centene. Centene, like United Health, these are two of the biggest health insurance companies in the United States. And the more I looked into it this week, the more I saw that there are many GP consortia and CCGs up and down the country that have reached this advanced stage of actually handing over the majority of their budgets to the management of these health giants. And just to put it in perspective, the budget, so the total revenue of United Health last year was $226 billion, of Operose, of Centene, $74.6 billion. So these companies are bigger than our national health system. Our CCGs currently, who run GP consortia, are responsible for 80% of the health budget. And it's this budget that they are now targeting. This has been accelerating during this pandemic. So the idea that the NHS is being protected, we've seen the way PPE, has been farmed out to the private sector, the acquisition of it for $5 billion. We've seen the way Test and Trace has actually been given to Dido Harding for $12 billion. 12 billion. All of this money not going through the NHS, but going away from it through cronies of the Tory party, but more importantly, to the private sector, away from the National Health Service, away from a national response. And that's precisely why, this is directly linked in this instance to why there's been absolute inefficiency of our ability to track and trace and isolate, so that actually the very thing we needed to do over the summer months when the cases were sparse was not done. So that actually the real policy we are actually facing is herd immunity, but it's punctuated by these extreme and draconian measures which are ineffective precisely because the basics of really protecting the NHS, really testing and then acting on the data, sharing the data, acting on the data, actually socially isolating and supporting the community, not having 5 million people who are in fact destitute and can't afford to isolate. We know that 20% of people who are traced actually isolate. If 80% aren't doing it, it's not just because they're bloody minded or they have no care for themselves or society. It's because they can't afford to do so in terms of their level of poverty. These are the real problems that are driving it, not just the question of lockdown on lockdown, which in a sense is almost, though it affects us all, it's almost a secondary question, ignoring the fundamental problem. James.
No, sure. I mean, look, you mentioned China and you mentioned sort of track and trace. Obviously, China used what could be described as a rather old technology. People on the streets with questionnaires, literally doing tracking. Our Test and Trace app, frankly, has been a nightmare. It was tested on the Isle of Wight and in Barking and Dagenham. It then disappeared for months on end because, of course, there was the big row about whether it should be centralised, whether we should use the Apple and Google system. We now have an app which appears to be wholly ineffective for what we need it to do. And surely that's part of the reason we are now in the mess we are in. So, Ranjit, what do we need to do to trace carriers of the virus and get this sorted out? If you were advising the government, what would you be saying?
Well, obviously, having said I wouldn't have started from here, there are things that we can do. I think if you look at the commentary that's coming, for example, from Independent Sage, I think it's perfectly sound. So they have been calling essentially for tracking and tracing to be done via the NHS, for Lighthouse Laboratories, in fact, to turn over the testing capacity back to the NHS, for us to put the investment through the NHS. And as you're quite right, a huge number of people will never download the app. They won't download it because they don't trust big data. The app itself, the development has been very inefficient, and that mirrors actually other big data management projects that the government have been involved in, whether that's, you'll remember the fiasco perhaps around the new airport system an air traffic control system being rolled out. Very often they have the similar problems even when they're trying to commission fighter jets, they end up with software that doesn't work for fighter jets after, many years, sometimes decades of development. The software doesn't work. And there've been problems within the NHS with very big data as well. So there isn't a centralized process. There isn't one person who's responsible for it. It tends to be contracted out to a consortium of private companies, a bit like the train system, what kind of chaos was caused and when accidents are happening. And it's hard to work out actually who is responsible for the fact that the project has been a failure. So those are ongoing issues. The National Health Service has a huge amount of expertise despite it being run down. Its capacity has essentially been halved in terms of beds, and there was ample opportunity to reverse that, not just since the pandemic has been begun. And I don't accept the argument that the Nightingale hospitals essentially are an increase in capacity. They're not. We found out after a bit of kind of wondering what was happening back in March that the Nightingale hospitals, essentially, their problem was they were never adequately staffed. The people needed to staff intensive care beds, and it was envisaged that they would be intensive care facilities. Just don't grow on trees. You need highly specialized nurses, doctors, physiotherapists, technicians of all kinds. They are in short supply in the NHS. The NHS actually traditionally has had an undercapacity in terms of its intensive care, and that couldn't just be expanded at the last minute. So these are long-term issues. Operation Cygnus I think, again, this is something that I'm amazed is not in the news more often. It should be an absolute national scandal. Jeremy Hunt, who was so unpopular with myself, I was just ending my junior doctor career and becoming a consultant when he was changing the junior doctor's contract, which essentially was a 40 to 50% pay cut on junior doctors, which was ultimately imposed after he helped really taxed
junior
out.
doctors, of course, went on strike over this. It was previously unheard of for medics who, of course, people rely on for their health and frankly, their life, would walk out. But such was the seriousness that junior doctors felt compelled to walk out.
They did in a very limited capacity, but that was really aside. So that was the Jeremy Hunt that we're talking about, who was probably the longest-serving health minister since the Second World War. He had a mission to introduce the Health and Social Care Act 2012. He had a mission to oversee the privatisation of the NHS in line with quite well worked out long-term strategy documents that were pursued both by Tory and by Tony Blair's government. Labour and Tory alike, but he oversaw an operation called Operation Cygnus. We discussed it with George before. This was an operation he ran in 2016 to model a pandemic, and even though they were running essentially a pandemic for a slightly different kind of a virus, more akin to flu, what was very clear to them was that they had an undercapacity in terms of intensive care, an undercapacity in terms of beds overall, that the NHS would be overwhelmed and would fall over. And really what was necessary the outcome of that was clear to them, and they've still buried the report. We only have reports of the report, so I haven't seen the full report. No one has seen the full report. It's essentially protected under the Official Secrets Act. They buried that report. There should be an outcry to get hold of that report, because I'm quite sure that within that report it will clearly state that there needs to be an increase in capacity. That increase in capacity goes against the whole ethos and direction of travel, which we're following under NHS 2012, which essentially is one of going towards an insurance-based system, which is why I bring up the fact that we're reaching such an advanced stage of this, where clinical commissioning groups, or groups of GP now plan our NHS. There's not the overriding planning from a central level there used to be. And part of that was that they came up with a body called Public Health England, which was a kind of a receptacle of all kinds of planning, forward thinking, and if you like, looking at health inequalities that used to be done by other bodies which had been wound down on the journey towards privatising NHS. And it's this precise body in the heart of this pandemic that our current administration and Matt Hancock are winding up and replacing with the National Institute of Health Protection, so-called, together with the Joint Biosecurity Centre, which really is going to be in isolation looking at pandemics, but forgetting really the question of planning, health strategy, of long-term health inequalities, the very things which are being exacerbated by not just by lockdown, but by actually this economic crisis, by the increasing impoverishment, by increasing unemployment. These issues which came up in terms of health outcomes that the NHS used to deal with and no longer dealt with. What we're seeing is a very steady pressure throughout this process, not just for tendering to individual, Tory grandees, but for the wholesale privatisation of our NHS. And this is reaching an advanced stage. What desperately needs to be done is for us to scrap PFI and stop paying the huge premiums that we pay to banking consortium out of the budget that should be providing health. We desperately need to stop farming out of NHS services via the private sector. We desperately need to increase the capacity in bed care. We desperately need to increase our social care provision, which has been wholesale privatized since the 1990s. And now the remarrying of the two is actually a toxic pill which is being used, in fact, to further privatize the NHS rather than redress this problem. These are the urgent measures. They're not measures that our government is capable of following because it goes against their entire ethos. But yes, in terms of the simple tracking and tracing, it's unquestionably the case that people with clipboards going into the street and questioning, going to find the people with positive test results, explaining to them the issue, and actually helping them to isolate. Moreover, social isolation, so that people are not just left on their own, unable to cope, actually having to go out and mix with the general population in order to look after themselves, but cared for, looked after until they're well, when they're then rehabilitated in the community. All of these measures are possible, even under this system where there is a political will. Of course, where the system anyway tends towards care of its population as opposed to care of profits of a very wealthy elite. There was a total different approach from the beginning, which explains the totally different course of the pandemic and why China, incidentally, will be the only country probably this year that has a positive GDP, whose economy grows and who's got its society back to normal, James.
And just finally, Ranjit, obviously people today on Twitter trending in the United Kingdom throughout the whole day has been a hashtag around non-compliance, people saying they're fed up, they've had enough, you know, they won't carry on. You know, I think people are looking for some kind of light at the end of the tunnel. You know, it's been a torrid year. Are we any nearer to some kind of treatment, vaccine? You know, are we near the end? Are we even halfway?
Halfway, I mean, probably not in terms of halfway of the population having had the virus. So, you know, if everyone's had the virus, that's the end of it. So, you know, this will come to an end one way or another. And I guess what we're arguing about in terms of the policy is the best way that it should be dealt with to minimize the impact. I totally understand why people are fed up. I'm, you know, quite fed up of the ongoing restriction and disruption of my life. I think they need to put the blame where it lies, which is firmly and squarely with the government, firmly and squarely with the policies of privatization of the NHS. But, you know, non-compliance, I understand why people feel that they've had their lives torn apart, particularly if they've lost jobs. The unemployment rate, we don't absolutely know, but it may, you know, come to greater than 10% of the population. That's a huge amount of, you know, economic dislocation. That is not the result of lockdown. That is not the result of the pandemic alone. This is the result of the economic system under which we live and a particular bad crisis that it is facing, you know, and that is a global phenomenon. But in terms of non-compliance, I understand why, if the measures were essentially ineffective, you know, which, you know, we knew that the tier 3 measures were ineffective. The communication has been poor. The leadership is not there. The fundamental support of the poorest sections of the population are not there. They're unable to comply. A large proportion of the population are unable to comply, even if they want to. It will be unenforceable once you lose the goodwill of the population. And I fear we're getting to the point where a large percentage of the population, you know, their goodwill has been lost. Businesses will comply. Those with something to lose will comply. And therefore, you know, working people will have their lives affected. It's not something that's in our hands to manage independently. There has to be a national strategy.
Dr. Ranjit Brar, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and look forward to having you back again next week when I'm sure George will be presenting once again. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, James.
You've been stuck with me so far this evening. Thank you very much for sticking with it, but I know that you'll be missing the presenter, Double GG, your teacher here on the Open University of the Airwaves. George, of course, also presents Sputnik Weekly on a Saturday. So I want to pass over now to a very special guest, which George interviewed on this week's Sputnik. You'll see an extract now, and you can see the whole interview at rt.com/shows/Sputnik. Take it away, Chris.
I'm going to talk to a man who is a rock, pop, and cultural legend, an icon, the commander of the police, the man that put the police together. These great, iconic songs that will never be forgotten, he played the drums on all of them. You unashamedly wrote the title, My Dad the Spy. Did you ever at any time when it was, I don't know, in the hippie era, the anti-Vietnam War era, were you ever embarrassed that your dad was the CIA?
No, nor was it a surprise when it was so revealed. Because in Beirut, everybody's dad was a spy. Isn't yours? And one day, this is another of our family bedtime stories. Miles comes home from school and says, Dad, are you a spy? And my father says, who wants to know?
Fascinating stuff. As I say, you can see the whole interview at rt.com/shows/Sputnik. Richard in Manchester is on the line. Go ahead, Richard.
Hello, James. Thank you very much indeed for taking my call. I hope George gets better soon after his operation. I'd like to speak, if I may, James, about this fact of the kids not getting their free meals. And it takes me back to the time when my father, who was a coal miner, and my mother, who worked in the factories here, and my sisters and brothers, there were 13 of us. If we hadn't have had school meals, I don't think we would have survived. It was so entrenched with the people who lived around here, particularly the socialists, particularly the Labour people, and without them we wouldn't have survived. And for us to be today in this, when we're one of the richest nations in the world, can't provide for kids to have a good meal. I don't care whether it's the Labour Party or whether it's the Conservative Party. I think it's a disgrace.
Look, Richard, I agree with you. The Tories have had a huge amount of conflicts and rebellions throughout this COVID crisis, but choosing the issue of feeding school children as the hill to die upon seems a rather strange choice to me. And thank goodness for the likes of Sir Marcus Rashford, whose campaign inspired community groups, businesses, to hand out free meals during the school holidays. I mean, I was involved in a group where I live in South London, handing out lunches to children. I think it is incomprehensible that in this day and age, school children are going hungry. On social media, you'll find all sorts of people saying, well, lazy parents this, can't be bothered to work that. But why should innocent children be punished if the parents choose not to work? And another thing I think is important to remember here, Richard, is who is eligible for free school meals. Because I think it's really crucial, and something that is so often overlooked in the media, is in order to be eligible for free school meals, you have to be on universal credit and earn no more than £7,400 a year if you're on universal credit. I mean, that income threshold is tiny.
It's a disgrace, James, an absolute disgrace. And may I say that historically, since the days in 1895, Marx and Engels came to Great Britain to look at the plight in that time scale of the coal mining industry, of the cotton mills, and the plight of the poor people all those years ago, and we're still here today. And my granddaughter has just written a stage radio play called Letters to Lenin, in which Marx and Engels reported back to Lenin about the plight of the poor people in Manchester, particularly in the coal mines and cotton mills. And it's a four-parter available on Amazon that people can buy for a pittance, really, and hear a wonderful narration of exactly what happened in those days. And when we are here, you and I and Dr. Bra and Professor Wolf and people like that on a great show tonight, they're extolling what is a great shame of this world, that we can't look after the poor kids. And if we take it just to one country, the United Kingdom anyway, and we can't provide as a rich nation, it's a very, very shameful thing. And I think they should hang their heads in shame, take notice of what Ratchford has highlighted, and make sure, hopefully, James, that it never happens again.
I quite agree. Richard, thank you very much indeed for your call. There's been a huge amount of social media comments this evening, Facebook, Twitter. Jamie, how's it looking?
It's looking busy, James. Very, very busy indeed. You've got a few fans in the old comment box on YouTube. Keep them coming in, by the way. Tweets, comments and emails, of course, to onair@moats.tv. Wakas says, you should be a regular on Moats, James. You've done an incredible job. And I'm amazed by the brilliance of your language and political acumen. You've impressed a few people.
Too kind.
But there's plenty more where that came from. But without massaging your ego too much, I'll get to a reaction from Ranjit's interview. Now, I was sort of expecting there to be quite a split in the Moats audience tonight. People sort of supportive of the lockdown, maybe not thrilled about it, but ready to grin and bear it. But to be honest, I've not seen much support for the government's decision at all. So Bournless here says they will not be satisfied until they've destroyed every little business and heavy industry, most of which has dumbed down the nation of idiocy. I've got a comment here from someone who has a health condition. It's not about my feelings, not old, but I have a serious health condition and still against the lockdown based on the data that I've seen. Business in my villages have gone bust. I only see cost. And then I've got another one here on the same vein saying suicides will go up from unemployment, cancers and other serious illnesses go untreated. I think the cost outweighs the benefits and I have a serious health problem too. So really, James, not a lot of people behind this lockdown and the government's decision to, as we've heard from Michael Gove this morning, maybe put us into lockdown indefinitely, depending on that data. Now, just circling back to the election, which I mean, I've mentioned is a massive, major talking point in the chat box tonight, which I don't know why we would have expected anything else. And I've got a comment here which is really, really interesting. Now, I've seen 5 presidents in my lifetime. I can honestly say this election is null and void. Neither candidate deserves to be elected, and both sides should be behind bars. Impeach Trump and charge Clinton and her crime family for all their scams and shenanigans. Biden, well, he will be in a bath chair before too long, although his son Hunter should be jailed for his actions in Ukraine. And now this question here, this comment here from Maribel in New York, who says, I'd vote for Kanye West if I could be bothered. He hasn't bombed or killed anyone. His records aren't what they were. But do you seriously trust Biden after his business deals in Ukraine? Don't make me laugh, which is a really important point, which I don't think has been mentioned on tonight's show, at least enough. The Kanye West aspect, Trump actually supporting Kanye West as a third-party candidate. Potentially what we're seeing here is some votes taken away from Biden, from people who want to vote for Kanye. Of course, Kanye isn't going to win the election, but what it is maybe doing is taking away some of those important Democratic votes, because as we've seen there, some people neither supporting Trump or Biden. And I think Trump's maybe cottoned on to that. And, we've seen Trump supporting Biden. But what are your thoughts on Kanye's impact to this US election?
I mean, because of the way ballot access works, the number of ballots he will appear on, the number of states he appear on will be minimal. But there certainly is, I think, as I was talking with Professor Wolf earlier, a notable absence of any third-party candidate this time round, which at a time when the candidate's choice is so dire, you would have thought some sort of third party would have come forward. I don't think Kanye will have a huge impact. He certainly won't get any more than, I'd say, 1% of the vote. But had he have been on every ballot in every state, that could have ended up very differently.
And then I'll just wrap it up, James, tonight with one last comment concerning the US election from Mary in Vermont. Sorry, Marty, forgive me, in Vermont. He says, I'll spoil my ballot paper when I vote because none of the above candidates represent me or can help heal what's actually going on in America right now. Trump has empowered dark forces of the far right and validated everything that they say. His electoral base comprises of gun nuts and racists. Is this the best we can see in 2020? And I think just from that comment there, it just sort of goes to show what an incredibly strange state the world is right now. And I think as the rest of 2020 plays out, it could only get crazier.
I agree. And Jamie, let me make a prediction to you and the listeners now. I think that Marty speaks for a huge swathe of the US electorate. And I would put it to you and the listeners, there will be a record number of spoilt ballots in the presidential election this Tuesday.
It's a shame because it's probably one of the most important elections potentially that we've seen in a while.
I think it is. Jamie, thank you very much indeed for keeping us up to date throughout the show. Patrick in Mississippi, over the pond, is on the line about the US elections. Good evening, Patrick.
Hey, good evening, Mr. Giles. You're doing a great job filling in for Double G, and my thoughts and prayers are with him and his family, and I hope his surgery will be successful. I wanted to call about, of course, the election that is upon us here in the United States on Tuesday night, November the 3rd. I am in Mississippi, which is, of course, a very hardcore, rock-ribbed, red Republican state. Trump is probably going to carry the state by 20 to 25 percentage points. And so that allows me the opportunity to vote third party without, really affecting the election because of how the American system is with the Electoral College, et cetera. And other individuals in other states aren't permitted that luxury. But, you were talking about Kanye West and third-party candidates. And I think it's such a shame, the quality of third-party candidates in this election cycle compared to previous elections. Earlier this year was hoping that the Libertarians would nominate Justin Amash as their candidate.
Yeah.
Because I think that he would really be, I'm not saying that he would win because, of course, he wouldn't. But he would certainly, or at least potentially, have an effect on the outcome of the election.
Well, certainly. And of course, George, was saying how Governor Jesse Ventura should have been nominated as the Green candidate.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that Ventura, same thing. And had Ventura been nominated by the Greens, and had the Greens, been able to qualify to be on the ballot in all 50 states in the District of Columbia, I think that I think Ventura. There's a good chance Ventura would win the election. Because you look at his record, you look at what he did in Minnesota as it relates to the gubernatorial election that he won. He would be a major player. But the only minor party that has ballot access in all 50 states and D.C. are the Libertarians.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, for what it's worth, perhaps not much. They put up a very inadequate candidate in Joe Jurgensen, very disappointing. So I just think I personally think Trump's going to win both the Electoral College and the popular vote this time around. But I really wish, moving forward, the United States, in my own country, the candidates for both major political parties would be a little more desirable and of a better quality than what we've had over the last 20 to 30 years.
Well, look, it's a somewhat controversial view, Patrick. It's not one that the pollsters necessarily share, but the bookies would certainly have it that Trump is set to win. And our poll, it would seem, is that way as well. 63% of our voters said that Donald Trump should win the election, or rather would win the election, never mind should. Meanwhile, only 37% said that Joe Biden would win on Tuesday. Patrick, thank you so much for that call and for that insight. Sarkar is in Glasgow. Good evening.
Hi, James. This is Sarkar from Glasgow. Really nice to see you, filling George's shoes. Would love to see both of you do a show together.
Bless you.
And hope George gets well soon. Please pass on my message to him.
I certainly will. He's listening in tonight.
Cheers. So, James, my question is with relations to what happened to Jeremy Corbyn recently with respect to the decision to suspend him from the party.
Yeah.
At this point in time, the Tories have left an open goal. You can take a free kick, a penalty kick, and still score. But Keir Starmer has decided to do something like this, which has annoyed the people who truly believe in the core values of Labour. And I'm not talking about the Blairites. And not just that, the unions, who have been the biggest backers of Labour, many of them want to, keep away from this, and they are not too happy with the way Keir Starmer has been dealing with this thing with Corbyn. What do you think would be the prospects? I heard a gentleman from Hong Kong calling some time ago.
Yes.
He summed it up perfectly. Of course, I cannot say this, speak as eloquently as him. But the thing which Keir Starmer has done right now, antagonizing the unions, antagonizing the people who believe in the core values of Labour, what does that mean for the prospects of Labour Party? And I'm not talking 2024 elections, but as Labour Party, will there be a schism between the ones on his side and the ones not on his side? How could that play out? Thanks, James. That's my question.
No, thank you, Sarkar, for that call. Well, look, it's certainly an interesting question. You know, last year we've seen with the centrists breaking away, as Patrick Christys mentioned at the start of the show. They started off as the independent group, turned into Change, the independent group, then Change UK, Change.org. Who knew what they were called in the end? And they certainly did not end up having a big impact. Of course, none of them kept their seats, not even the great Chuka Umunna, who, of course, of all of them, was the best known. And so it's always incredibly difficult under our electoral system to have a new party set up, successfully organised, successfully fundraise and win. But you certainly present an interesting point around Keir Starmer, which is, of course, whilst major donors, high net worth donors, are now returning to the Labour Party, who perhaps previously had abandoned it under Corbyn, the unions who make up the vast bulk of the Labour Party's funding in Great Britain are beginning to reduce their funds. And so it will be really fascinating to see where this leads Labour, not least as to whether Corbyn will be readmitted, but further as to whether or not they will continue to have the very plush funding they had under Corbyn, not least because he turned the party into a mass membership movement. Sarkar, thank you very much indeed for that. On a similar topic, Eddie is in Barrow on line 2. Go ahead, Eddie.
Hi. Yeah, basically, I've been listening to the show on and off because obviously I'm out and about working tonight. But my point is this. As far as I'm concerned, Corbyn has clearly been thrown under the bus by the party. They've been waiting for an excuse to get him, and they've got him. And the reason I say that is I was a long-term Labour member and Labour supporter, and I resigned from the party just under 10 years ago because of the amount of hatred, not just for anti-Semitism, I'm talking disabled hatred, etc. And when it was raised, bearing in mind I'm a disabled person, I raised one concern I had when my local party basically excluded any person with a disability from being anywhere near them. I was told quite bluntly by the regional office to drop it and go away.
Really?
Really. And I to this day, I will never, and bearing in mind I was brought up Labour, parents before me were Labour, their parents were Labour, we've always voted Labour as a family.
Yeah.
I resigned after I clearly, because at the end of the day, people always talk about all the this, the that, the other. I don't believe in, if I see it, I accept it.
Yeah.
If I don't see it, I'll take it as a pinch of salt.
Of course.
But when I saw it firsthand, the way that, again, I'm not going down the route that they're saying, anti-Semitism, I'm going down the disabled route, especially, because I saw that firsthand. Yeah. I could not be party to any party that treated somebody with a disability in that manner. It was from roots, and I'll say this from experience, from grassroots. I'm talking elected individuals. I'm not talking like me and you, Joe Public. I'm talking people within the power, i.e. elected individuals, councillors, MPs. It goes up the chain, are in it for their own benefit and nobody else's.
Yeah.
And I saw that firsthand.
It's an experience. You're not the first person to have told me a similar experience, Eddie. I'm very sorry to hear it. But, you know, it's the members, of course, that make up any political party. And if the party machine treats the members with contempt, well, then I think as Labour are beginning to see, the members won't hang about.
Exactly. And I think that's what's, to be blunt, is why they've thrown Corbyn under the bus. You know, it's from my opinion, as I said, I've never met the guy. I've just obviously seen what media's put out, etc., you know what I mean? Yeah. But as a person that sat and watched well, I won't say rise because he was around in the 70s, but as a person that sat and watched the amount of abuse and grief he's got, even though he's, doubled, probably trebled the membership of the Labour Party, I think that's exactly why they threw him under the bus, because they were scared that he was uncontrollable, to put it bluntly.
Yeah, no, it's certainly a view which some people on social media seem to be sharing, Eddie.
Well, exactly. He was not there for what he could get out of it himself. If he was, then, you know, why would he have been on all these relevant rallies and everything else? And bearing in mind, I live in a town that he wanted to basically shut down because of the nuclear deterrent, because we built them.
Yeah, absolutely. Eddie, I'm going to have to stop you there, but it's a fascinating point. Thank you very much. The reason for that, of course, is we have a legend on the line. It's Norma in Bristol. Go ahead, Norma.
Hello, James. Nice to hear you.
Likewise.
And, nice to hear Galloway as well.
Absolutely.
Actually, also, is it Jamie Lowe's birthday Tuesday?
It is indeed, yes.
Yeah. Anyway, that's not what I was going to say. We've got you had Professor Wolf on,
yes,
Richard Wolf, and he was saying what a bad system of voting that they've got in the USA. But, you know, our electoral system is not much better.
No,
we've got first, we got the first past the post. We have constituencies which win seats for the political parties.
Yes.
But if all the votes were counted individually,
yes,
that result might be different.
It would be completely different. Yes, you're absolutely right.
And if we had proportional representation, like the most of Europe do,
yes,
you know, it would be a fairer system, don't you think?
Absolutely, Norma. I wholeheartedly agree with you on that one. When we have when we had European elections, of course, that's how insurgent parties like the Brexit Party are able to win. You know, 2010 Liberal Democrats picked up 26% of the vote for less than 10% of seats in the British Parliament. It seems mental, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, and I wouldn't vote for the UKIP, but let's be fair, they won about 5 million votes, and they had no seats representing them in Parliament. We really need to think about ours and not be so, what's the word, complacent about our system.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and many of the arguments that Richard outlined for the American system being problematic certainly also apply here in Britain, Norma. I think you make a fantastic point. Listen, I've been your supply teacher this evening, but have you enjoyed the show?
Oh, yes, I have.
I'm very pleased to hear it. I'm very pleased to hear it.
It's nice to see you, and I'm hoping that George will be better by Wednesday. But
he certainly will.
No, I've enjoyed it. Yes.
I'm very pleased to hear it. Norma, listen, it's a pleasure to hear from you, especially in lieu of George. It's an honour. You're a legend here at the mother of all talk shows. So thank you very much indeed for your call. I'm joined again now once more by Mrs. Galloway, Gayatri. Hello again. Welcome back to the studio.
Thank you, James.
Just here to wrap up with me. Of course, I've been filling in this evening for George, who has an operation tomorrow, so doctor's orders. He has to have an early night. But I'm very pleased to say that all being well, God willing, he'll be back with us on Wednesday for Moats Extra, and then, of course, next Sunday for Moats. We've got a fascinating show coming up on Wednesday, haven't we, Gertrude?
We do. We are having a fascinating show. It's going to be the 9/11 show, so lots of interesting conspiracies going to come up. James, how was it? How was it for you? Just so people know, James came here on the spot at 3 hours' notice. I mean,
yes.
Boy,
yeah,
what a wonder
right.
boy,
yes.
seriously.
No, you're too kind. It was at 3 hours' notice, you're quite correct. But no, it's been a pleasure and it's been an honour. I mean, the comments from social media, at least, so Jamie says, he may just be being polite, and that's fine too. But people seem to have enjoyed it. Norma did. And I'm pleased because it's been a whistle-stop tour, I hope, of the key issues of the week. But I've certainly enjoyed it.
Well, I mean, it's amazing. I'm so happy you've enjoyed it because we're all in awe and George, I just have to convey personally from George how happy he is. He's been watching the whole show, and he's just amazing. He's just amazed at the way you convey the whole show. It was wonderful.
No, bless you.
So thank you so much on behalf of George, and thank you also to the audience who have been watching and calling in tonight.
Absolutely.
With the supply teacher.
Indeed. I mean, we haven't actually been able to get round, so I'm told in my earpiece, to everyone who called in this evening. And so my message to them, of course, is you can email in to onair@moats.tv. And also, please, call in on Wednesday as well. It's
Absolutely.
a free phone number if you live in Britain on a Wednesday. So there's no excuse not to call in and talk back to the proper teacher, George Galloway.
Yeah, so that's on patreon.com/George Galloway.
Indeed.
You just you just sign up, and then on the day itself, on the Wednesday, you just click on the link to view the whole show, where we will be back again as well.
We certainly will be. Yes, you only get that on Patreon in the pre-show and the post-show.
Exactly.
And of course, I think it's so important for people to know the outstanding value of Moats Extra. It's $1 per show.
Yeah.
So no matter whether you're a millionaire or someone who is just struggling to get by, it's $1.
It's less than a cup of coffee.
Less than a cup of coffee for a whole evening of entertainment. I would challenge any of our listeners to find better value anywhere in the media sphere.
Quite a challenge.
It certainly would be a challenge. But no, it's been a fascinating show, and I'm sure we all wait with bated breath to see what happens in the US election on Tuesday.
Yes, wow. Where's your money on?
My money's on Trump. £15 at the bookies.
Same here. Not in money terms, but yeah, Trump probably.
I think it will be, despite what the pollsters say. Yeah. I mean, pollsters have a habit, don't they, of getting it wrong. Listen, I've been James Giles. Thank you very much indeed for putting up with me. Next to me has been Mrs. Galloway, Gayatri. It's been a pleasure. Please come back again next week. It's been marvellous for me, and I hope it was for you. Come back again next week and bring another listener with you. I've been James Giles. Thank you very much indeed.